Welcome to the regular meeting of the Planning Commission, Thursday, October 8th, 2015, 7:30, Brisbane City Hall.
It's not on.
Okay, sorry.
No, they're on.
It's on, but it's not. I guess it's not. Sorry. Give us a second. Can you hear me now? Sorry.
Better now.
Okay. So, again, regular meeting of Brisbane Planning Commission, Thursday, October 8th, 2015, 7:30 p.m., Brisbane City Hall, 50 Park Place, Brisbane. Could we have call to order? That was call to order. Can we have roll call, please?
Commissioner Anderson?
Present.
Commissioner Doe?
Present.
Commissioner Manier?
Here.
Commissioner Parker?
Here.
Commissioner Reinhardt?
Here.
May I have a motion to adopt the agenda?
I make a motion to adopt the agenda.
I'll second that.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Great. Okay. On to new business. Public hearing, Brisbane Baylands Final Environmental Impact Report and related planning applications, Baylands Concept Plans, Brisbane Baylands Specific Plan, General Plan Amendment Case GP-01-06. Specific topics include geology, hazards and hazardous materials, hydrology, and water quality. Universal Paragon Corporation is the applicant. Owners are various. APN is various.
Madam Chair, before we start, can I make a recommendation? Last time when we had the hearing, we had two topics, and we said we want to separate it together, and as it turned out, that didn't work. So what I suggest is maybe we can take one each topic at a time, get the comments on that, close that, and go to the next topic. So like, for example, we can start with geology. People who have the comments about geology, they can come forward. We finish that, and we go to hazard and hazardous material. The order will remain the same, but I think record will be a lot cleaner that way.
What do other commissioners think? I think that's fine, but
Okay?
is that okay with everyone?
I think it's a little too difficult, but I won't object if you want to try to do it that way.
Yeah, because some
Agreed.
people,
Yeah.
I think,
Give it a
some people
try.
have a mix. Yeah, we can give it a try, but
We can try it, and if it doesn't work, then...
have overlapping concerns.
Yeah.
Okay, so just some ground rules. There are ground rules out front for anyone who is interested. Basically, the meeting is going to be broken up into three pieces. The staff report first, then the commission questions related specifically to the report, and then we open public hearing. Note that the adopted PC rules call for hearing to end at 10:30 unless extended. I wanted to ask other commissioners how they felt about an extension, but personally, 10:30 is as far as I can go tonight, but I would defer to what other commissioners think.
I think that will be okay until 10:30.
Okay.
And, if need to be, we
If
can
needed.
extend to the next week or next Tuesday.
I think that it's going to be very full tonight. The comments I expect, since the sections we're covering are very important and have a lot of material in them, and there are three of them. But I don't think that leaving at 10:30 or leaving at 11 is going to make a difference on whether we can hear everyone or not. So I think we should just do our best tonight and extend future comments with apologies to a later session.
Okay.
And may I also
Agreed.
suggest to turn the air conditioning on a little bit? It's kind of warm here, especially light shining on top of us.
And the goal is to allow the public to fully participate in the hearings and have their say in a manner that is respectful to everyone's time and scope on the task. Meetings can be extended. Meetings can also be continued to another night if there is a need. The organization of the public hearing portion, could I have a show of hands to see how many people are interested in speaking?
5, 6, 7.
I count 7, 8. I count 8. And we are going to try to adhere to the structure that was last week. It seemed to have worked. We're kind of going to break it up into 3 segments, 1 minute and under, 3 minutes and under, and 5 minutes and under, and then anything above 5 minutes mark. So could I have a show of hands? How many people are kind of estimating they're going to be in the 1 minute mark?
2.
2? Okay. And how many are going to be in the 3 minute mark?
4.
5.
4, 5.
5? Okay. And how many are going to be in the 5 minute mark? One? Okay. And anyone above 5 minutes? Oh, this is just an estimate, okay. So 1. Okay, so if individual speakers need to have time extended, we would definitely entertain that. All speakers are requested to fill out speaker cards, please. We make a concerted effort to take notes while you are talking so that we can refer to these things in detail as best we can. The speaker cards are out front. Please help us keep this going well and also organized and recorded for the record by filling out one of these and submitting it to us so that we can keep things moving along. And we'll try to, again, organize according to the length of the speakers so that folks who have less to say can feel free to go and not have to sit through the entire thing to get their 1 minute said. As a courtesy to your fellow citizens, please adhere to the time limits established by the Planning Commission and agreed to by the community. Address questions and comments directly to the Commission. Please keep comments on the topic under consideration at tonight's meeting, but we will entertain other related issues as well. If somebody has already made a comment you're going to make, please state your support. No need to repeat that previous statement. The purpose of the hearing is to allow everyone to make their own comments. It is not a debate. Please refrain from responding to or critiquing other public comments that have been made because we're here to hear everyone. So, with that said, can we have the staff report?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chairman. Before Lloyd Zola gets started with the presentation, I want to introduce one other member of the city's consultant team who's present tonight. And that would be Dr. Susan Mearns, who is sitting to my left. Dr. Mearns was a consultant the city hired when it came to review of the draft EIR comments. She reviewed both the draft EIR data as well as the draft EIR comments related to hazardous materials, and the responses to the DEIR comments reflect her input. Her review was an independent peer review. She was not involved in the preparation of the original draft EIR. So, and again, just by way of background, she has a PhD in environmental health engineering, several registrations with Cal EPA and OSHA, and has over 20 years of professional experience in the field. So she'll be here only tonight. So again, if there are questions related to the hazardous materials section of this presentation that Dr. Mearns could answer, it would really be the best opportunity to get her input tonight. She will not be present at other meetings. So with that, I'll turn the presentation over to Mr. Zola.
We'll start, we're actually going to start tonight with hazards and hazardous materials and go to geology, then flooding. When we look at site remediation, Title 27 landfill closure, and the whole issue of hazards and hazardous materials, we'll be talking about 3 different areas on the site. In the northwest portion of the site, we'll refer to Operable Unit 1, or OU1, which is the northern portion of the former Railyard. To the south of that, we'll refer to Operable Unit 2, OU2, which is the southern portion of the Railyard, and then we'll also be referring to the landfill. Now, the regulatory authority, as we'll talk about land use and then site remediation and also landfill closure, rests this way. The City of Brisbane is the land use agency. You have the authority to determine the appropriate land uses on the site. The other agencies who will oversee site remediation and landfill closure have no authority over your land use decisions. Now, site remediation is vested with 2 separate agencies. OU1, the responsibility and the regulatory authority for site remediation within that area, the northwestern portion of the site, lies with the California Department of Toxic Substances Control, DTSC. The Regional Water Quality Control Board has the regulatory authority for addressing contamination with OU2, southwestern portion of the site. And Title 27 landfill closure, and the reason I used that whole term is it became confusing to some people. The landfill closed in 1967, but under Title 27 of the California Code of Regulations, there are some very specific requirements as to capping of that landfill, and that's what I'll refer to as the Title 27 landfill closure, as opposed to just the act of closing the landfill. The regulatory authority for that rests with the Regional Water Quality Control Board, and also to an extent with the San Mateo County Health System as the local enforcement agency for solid waste management issues. As we've talked about for other subjects, the EIR that you have reviewed provides a programmatic analysis of site remediation and landfill closure. The EIR prepared at the very beginning of the process. This is not intended in the hazardous materials section. This is it. Certify this and we're all done with hazardous materials. This is laying out the first part of the process. Site remediation, landfill closure, and the discretionary actions that DTSC and the regional board will have to make on those will be subject to separate environmental review by those agencies before they can approve their plans. Some of the key terms that we'll be talking about and are addressed in the EIR: site characterization, waste characterization, which is an identification of what contamination exists on the site, site characterization, what are the constituents that are in the landfill, waste characterization. And the thing to keep in mind is the focus of characterization is not so much on what went into the landfill, but on what is there now in terms of contamination and potential risk to public health. Remediation is a term used in relation to OU1 and OU2, which is the cleanup of those sites. So when the term remediation is used, we're not talking about capping the landfill and the next issue, Title 27 closure of the landfill, which are all the requirements of meeting state law regarding the landfill to allow for future uses within the landfill area. Risk-based cleanup goals, and we had talked about this in, I think, one of our workshops. The remediation plans that will be done will be based on actual analysis of what are the risks to the public of the constituents of concern, the contaminants that are located there, based on what are the land uses being proposed, what are the actual risks to the public, as opposed to you see in some other states setting a cleanup standard, one size fits all. Here we are talking about in California, actual analysis of risks to the public from the constituents of concern from the contaminants on the site. And that is done through a human health risk assessment. We'll talk about health risk assessments later in terms of air quality and another hearing, but human health risk assessments that analyze, based on the contaminants that exist within the baylands, what will be the risks for the uses that you as a city determine are appropriate for the baylands. Now, operable unit 1, OU1 in the northwestern portion of the site, 3 primary areas of contamination. Volatile organic compounds, which are carbon-based, petroleum hydrocarbons, largely bunker C oil, which is a very thick oil, and heavy metals in the soil. Operable unit 2 in the EIR, the southwestern portion of the site, is described much the same way. The order a little bit different: petroleum hydrocarbons, volatile organic compounds, and then heavy metals. Substantial amount of contamination in that area, and actually fairly well identified through a series of studies that have gone on over the years. Within the landfill, a little bit different situation. The landfill started operation about 1932. The rules of the game, the rules that were followed with landfills in 1932 through the time it operated, closed in 1967, are very different than the rules for a landfill today. So the landfill practices during the lifetime of that landfill meant there's no liners in the landfill. They did not segregate waste from each other. The leachate collection systems were put in long after the closure as part of dealing with leachate, as opposed to an ongoing system of dealing with that as materials went into the landfill. And there were not the records you would see of a current landfill of what is placed where, what are the waste sources, and so the records relating to waste sources are fairly general and nowhere near as detailed as you would see in a current landfill. They're identified as residential, commercial, industrial, inert fill, liquid waste, and it really took some of the characterization studies that were done by actually coring into the landfill, I guess would be a good term, to pull out what was there as opposed to being able to rely on records. There's about 12.5 million cubic yards of waste sitting in that landfill. So this is not a small landfill. It's a substantial amount of waste sitting in there. There was an interim cover placed on top of the landfill. And so the EIR will talk about a landfill cover. That was an interim cover placed there. That is not the cover that would be expected or not the cover that would result from the more formal closure of the landfill pursuant to the requirements of Title 27. There is right now monitoring of leachate and landfill gas ongoing. There are collection systems in place. And we can have a discussion as a community as to whether those are adequate for future uses, but there are systems in place. And ultimately, a formal closure per the requirements of California Code of Regulations, Title 27, will be required. So whether the existing monitoring leachate systems, whether the existing landfill gas systems will be adequate for future is a determination that the regional board would make as part of that formal closure. The major issues that were addressed through comments on the draft EIR and that we dealt with in preparing the draft EIR. One is, are the studies done to characterize waste in the landfill adequate? And so there's a lot of comments raising concerns since we don't know everything that's in there. We may not know everything. There is not adequate study, and therefore we should not go ahead. The determination that was made as part of the EIRs, when you look at the series of studies over the years by different consultants at different times for different purposes, there is a body of knowledge that exists regarding characterization of waste on the site and characterization of waste and characterization of potential contaminants in the landfill. It has been studied over time. And we'll talk about the adequacy of those studies. The EIR determined were adequate for the purposes of this EIR to analyze what are the likely impacts of future development of the Baylands. The EIR that is in front of you prepared by or for the city does not purport to say the studies are adequate, the analysis is adequate to support approval of a remedial action plan for OU1 or OU2 or to support the actual plan for closure under Title 27, because those plans are not in front of you as a city. They are not in front of the regional board or DTSC. So what we are talking about through all of this is to get an understanding of what are the waste characteristics within the landfill, what is the contamination of the site, so that you as a city can make a land use decision. And based on, we'll talk about process of how that works. You will make a basic land use, I'll get to the process, it'll be a little bit more clear.
No, that's not the question I had.
Go ahead.
The question is, when is their remediation plan in this process going to happen?
Okay.
That is the next thing.
That is the next slide. Perfect. There is a mitigation measure in the EIR that sets forth a process that ties your land use review process to the remediation, Title 27 closure process, to site-specific development. That process is this. Initially, and as part of this EIR, you would identify what are the appropriate land uses within the Baylands, just at a general plan level. going not necessarily any further than your existing general plan has gone to say, this is what we believe, based on what we know now, are the appropriate uses within the Baylands at whatever you determine is the appropriate intensity. The applicant would then complete the actual plans for Title 27 landfill closure, would complete remedial action plans for OU1 and OU2. Those plans would go through the regulatory agency review, DTSC for operable unit 1, the regional board for operable unit 2, and the landfill. Those agencies would go through their own review process, their own CEQA process, and once, we'll just take OU1 is approved, there's a remedial action plan approved subject to CEQA for that area, then the city would entertain a specific plan covering OU1, and then the same for OU2. When that plan is done, then you would entertain specific plan approvals, and the same on the landfill. So what is that mitigation measure says is the approval of a general plan land use description is appropriate at this time, but as a community, we should wait for specific plan approval until after the remedial action plans are done, until after the Title 27 closure plan is done. The applicant did submit comments. They are not in agreement with that mitigation measure. They're here tonight, and I guess they'll talk to you about that. The idea then is once the plans are done, you as a city would then entertain specific plan that would then go through a project level CEQA review, because you would at that point know what specifically is approved where in relation to how ground will be remediated, how the landfill will be closed, and that would be the time you would undertake specific plan approval. Remediation of OU1 and OU2, closure of the landfill would then occur, and only after the actual remediation of operable unit 1 occurs would site-specific development applications for the area of OU1 come before the city. Only after remediation of OU2 is completed to the satisfaction of the regulatory agency would you entertain site-specific plans for development of OU2, and the same with the landfill. Only after that cap, the Title 27 cap closure is in place, would you entertain actual site-specific development for that area.
But for clarification, the first bullet point means certification of the EIR, and the second bullet point means develop the plan for closing the landfill. Is that correct?
Not necessarily, because remember, one of the options that you had that we talked about on September 24th is we'll start with an approval. If you would approve a general plan, tax, land use, that would require certification. So a recommendation to approve an application, a recommendation requires certification of the EIR. Recommendation to approve an alternative in the EIR as part of the general plan. So let's say you said, we wish to approve as part of our general plan the renewable energy alternative. You'd have two options there. One would be to certify the EIR, recommend that approval, or you could say, because that is a major change in the application, what we want is, our intent is to approve that alternative, come back with a determination as to whether this EIR will allow us to do that. If you say, for example...
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Sure.
I'd love to hear that one.
Okay. And the example would be if you decide at the end of this process, your recommendation would be, we think the city ought to approve any one of the alternatives. The one I just picked as the example was the renewable energy alternative. You could say, we want that adopted into the general plan. You then have two choices as to what you do with the EIR. So to make a formal approval of the application requires certification of the EIR. To make a major modification to that application, like take that, the renewable energy alternative or something else that you would craft later, you would have two choices. One would be to say, we will certify the EIR. Our recommendation is that the council certify the EIR and adopt, in the example I just used, the renewable energy alternative. You could also say, okay on that. Okay, your other option would be to say, because adoption of the renewable energy alternative or whatever alternative you crafted later is a major change to the application, we want that brought back to us to see the exact wording, to see whether the EIR does in fact cover that. So bring us back a package of what we would be willing to recommend that the council actually approve, along with the environmental dealing with that. The environmental dealing with whatever alternative you come up with may be findings that say the EIR is adequate because of A, B, C, and D to do that. It may be a new EIR. It may be recirculation of something much more specific. Without knowing what it is you'd want to approve, I can't tell you what the exact action would be. So does that make sense on your
Can you clarify whether you're referring this to the general plan or the amendment of the general plan? Because some of the alternates are not in the general plan at this point.
Right. The only thing what we talked about was in the general plan was that trade commercial, and there's a few specific categories. There is a description that says these are the appropriate land uses. You will, at the end of this process, have the opportunity to say, we believe the general plan should describe the baylands this way. We believe, one would be, we believe it describes it just fine right now. And we'll kind of walk you through some of the downsides of that. Or we believe it ought to describe the baylands this way. We believe it ought to describe it similar to, I just mentioned the renewable energy alternative. We believe it ought to describe the baylands some other way. And you've heard other recommendations on uses. So if you make that kind of change, you can then either certify the EIR or ask that we analyze whether what you want to do would require, what it would require under CEQA.
So in that instance, what will happen to the alternate general plan, that amendment that applicant is asking?
You would actually, in that case, the way that would go is if you want to recommend something that modifies the application, you say we want to modify the application this way. If you want to do something completely different, you would say we would recommend denial of the application, and instead this is what ought to be done. And when you get to the deliberations part, that's like December, we'll walk you through all of these.
Okay, I understand that scenario, but I have a couple of other scenarios that I would like clarification on. Supposing scenario number one, or number two, supposing we say, okay, this plan is great, we're going to certify the EIR and suggest approval for one of these plans and move forward, and then what happens if the new information of developing the landfill closure comes out and in some way changes our opinions? Do we have options to alter the plan at that point? And then the third scenario is, what if we get through this process and we say, gee, even with all of this information that's been brought before us, we're still not sure. We'd like to see more on the landfill closure plan and what the Regional Water Control Board is going to say, and so on and so forth. Do we have an option to do that? And then circle back to certify or not certify the EIR?
And the simple answer is yes, you have all of those options.
Okay.
Oh, good.
So, yeah, we'll walk you through all of that when we get through all of the subjects and you start crafting what would we like to see. We'll help you get there in terms of, one, how to describe whatever it is you're looking at the end, and then how to handle the CEQA part. Okay? So that is the discussion of there. This is the first time we'll talk about process in this way, and it will come up, I think, in a couple other areas. We'll now talk about geology and seismic considerations. The big issue with geology and seismic considerations is, we'll start with this. We had talked about in biology and in cultural resources, the baylands is a lot of non-engineered fill put onto bay mud. Over a period of years, it is not an engineered stable platform for development. The baylands is, and that doesn't mean it can't be made into one, but this is not, we're not putting something on soil that's sitting 10 feet over bedrock, which means that some of the engineering of structures will be in some way similar to what you've seen out at Sierra Point. Some fairly elaborate or some fairly substantial work would need to be done to create building platforms. Obviously, we're in a highly seismically active region, and so that needs to be taken into account, site-specific based on the soils that each individual building will sit on, and that will be part of studies that will go on as building locations are done, and it can be determined this is where a building's going to go, this is the site-specific conditions that its foundation would need. Particularly in the landfill area, there's the potential for ground over large areas settling at different rates. And so that has to be taken care of in terms of design. And the very general rule of thumb is the larger the building, the larger the foundation, the more issue there is, or the more you have to do to deal with part of the foundation settling at a different rate than another part. Very small building, it's nowhere near the same issue. Some of the soils out there are what are called expansive. When they get wet, they expand. When they dry, they contract. And buildings will need to be designed to deal with that kind of expansion and contraction. And underground utilities will also need to address the corrosive nature of some of the soils. So they will corrode certain metals, and that will need to be addressed in terms of site-specific design of infrastructure. Because groundwater is relatively high, there is the opportunity or potential in an earthquake, heavy shaking, liquefy soils, and you end up with something akin to mud. So design of buildings will need to address liquefaction also. The basic process for that is we know from the analyses done to date that those potentials exist. When there are plans that will say we know where individual buildings will go, there will be subsequent studies to apply the standards of the California Building Code to the site-specific conditions for each individual building. And finally, we'll talk about water quality and hydrology. The water quality issues that are out in the baylands deal with total suspended solids, oils and grease in some localized locations, the potential for leachate seeping out of the landfill, construction impacts, particularly during grading when ground is laid bare, and erosion and things that can occur there. And then once development is completed, urban pollutants in runoff, the kinds of things we all know from our driveway, a car leaking on a driveway, brake linings and other things, and just the normal problems that occur in terms of water quality in an urban area. This area in the baylands, because of the location of the lagoon, is a sensitive area. And so the design of drainage systems will need to account for all of these issues in terms of how to design to minimize impacts or avoid impacts related to water quality so that pollution of the lagoon is not occurring and pollution of waterways is not occurring. And there are a lot of state regulations that are handled by the Regional Water Quality Control Board related to those specific issues. And so what that means in terms of mitigation: compliance with National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System. The city has a municipal regional stormwater permit, and so there are requirements on what is allowed to go into a storm drain and pre-treatment for storm drain, for stormwater. There will be site-specific requirements that the Regional Water Quality Control Board will place on individual developments, stormwater pollution prevention plans, stormwater management plans, leachate collection systems. So there are a lot of systems that will be put in place as part of the regulatory process to deal with water quality mitigation. Flooding. This identifies right now the areas subject to the 100-year flood. Now, the 100-year flood, what that means is not it occurs every 100 years, because as they just found out in South Carolina, the 1,000-year flood can occur every 77 years. So what this means when I say 100-year flood is a flood that has a 1% chance of occurring in any particular year. It may not happen for hundreds of years. It could happen 2 to 3 years in a row, but a 1% chance. And this is the area that would be flooded in that 100-year flood. Now, there are other areas, anybody who's been out of the Baylands after a rain knows, there are areas that are so flat, there are low points out there, there are areas that don't drain. That is different than a 100-year flood. So, and we'll get to some of the basic standards. This is the 100-year flood today as mapped by the by FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency, in 2012. We also have heard a lot about sea level rise, and so what you see here are areas at risk, both in the green and the purple, at risk due to sea level rise. So there's a certain amount, the bay where it sits right now is not going to be the bay level 50 years from now. It's not going to be the bay level 100 years from now. And so based on mapping done for the San Francisco Bay, the EIR identifies areas subject to flooding just due to 100 years of sea level rise, and it's a substantial portion of the site.
Okay, I see 4 feet for the pink area. Is that correct? It says 3 point something meters.
1.4 meters.
So that'd be 4.5
4 feet, yeah.
4 feet. And then, but what is the green? Do you know what?
That's the area currently at risk.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And so now, the flooding requirement placed, the flood protection requirement placed by the EIR on new development within the Baylands is this: that the 25-year storm, the peak flow in a 25-year storm, 4% chance of occurring in a year, be handled totally in an underground piping system. The creek that runs through the middle is also included in that. But in a 25-year storm, the streets should be clear of water in the travel lanes. In a 100-year storm, that the site be designed to convey a 100-year peak flow. And the peak flow is also important because storm gathers, you hit a peak flow and then it drops off. So to carry that 100-year peak flow within the streets, within the piping system, so in a 100-year flood, water should not be spilling out over the curbs. But carried in that street such that one building elevations, first floor elevation, is 1 foot above that flow line, so that you've got 1 foot of safety margin. And 1 foot doesn't sound like that much when you look vertically, but if you think about 1 foot, how much that spreads out over a large area, that's actually a very standard engineering design. But 1 foot above that flow, not just in a 100-year flood, but a 100-year flood occurring at high tide, because that will affect it, and considering that 100 years of sea level rise. Because as the sea level rises, the water in the flood would come down and it will back up. So you will see over time that 100-year flood area expands. So this is the standard that would be placed. There were a number of comments on the draft EIR regarding, but we need to think about tidal considerations and sea level rise. This is the actual standard being placed on development within the Baylands. And so with that, if there's any question, be glad to take them. Otherwise, it's time for the public.
Thanks.
Does any commissioner have any questions?
Are you going to cover the hydrology and water quality next, or what? Yeah, this was part of it.
Yeah, this is part of tonight, so you have 3 subjects.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
you didn't address very much on the water quality. You're going to have further on that, or
Okay, we want to go back to that.
in terms of the pollutant parts per million and all that stuff?
Okay. And the water quality issues you have are related to, as I mentioned, related to the landfill and potential leachate seepage. And you have other existing industrial uses. You have the basic issues are laid out here. So total suspended solids. It could be metals, it could be soils, but basically siltation of in the flows that come down. You have oils and grease, and from the activities that have occurred in the past in the stormwater that's flowing through the baylands today. I mentioned the leachate seeps, and yeah, there is a system in place to collect leachate, and so the problems in recent years are much less than what you've seen in the past. During construction is one of the times that water quality issues and potential water quality problems will be at their greatest, because you will have grading of the site going on, which means potential for erosion. You will have construction going on and construction vehicles on dirt roads. And so the potential for oil and grease to fall on dirt that then runs off the site, that occurs is a potential during construction and those construction activities. Other construction impacts would be related to remediation of the site. So as remediation is going on, potential for runoff erosion during those times. And then in the post-development, the urban runoff and actually our streets, the normal streets in a city, are one of the major contributors to surface water pollution, because a lot of things collect in the street. Trash, garbage, oil, gas, things from cars. So mitigation measures for these are largely existing regulations. So one of the things is there are standards in a statewide permit that deal with how you handle runoff. And one of the things we used to be able to do is just take runoff and stick it in a pipe and let it run out to the bay. Don't get to do that anymore. So there will be requirements for pre-treatment of runoff. That before it gets into pipe and it's let out into the bay or into the lagoon. The city has a permit for its stormwater system that lays out requirements that the city must comply with before allowing water to run out of its storm drains. And so that addresses water quality and the kinds of pre-treatment that would be required. In relation to any grading permits, the regional board will then take a grading permit and it will have its own site-specific requirements for containing soils, for making sure that vehicles driving onto and off of construction sites are not tracking mud back out onto the streets. There will be provisions to make sure that potential erosion is contained within the site and isn't running off into the lagoon. There will be a required stormwater pollution prevention plan, so that each individual site will be required to come up with and implement. So here's one of the other keys under CEQA. Preparing a plan is a nice thing to do, but under CEQA that plan must also be implemented. So if I just say prepare a plan under CEQA, it's prepare and implement, if I don't specifically say implement. But there would have to be a plan for pollution prevention to prevent stormwater from carrying pollutants off construction sites. And then a stormwater management plan for the longer term that would provide a protection against the urban pollutants entering storm drains, entering waters. The final thing is as part of that Title 27 landfill closure, the regional board will look again at the leachate system that is in place, determine whether that will be adequate for use with whatever level of development the city would ultimately permit on top of that landfill, and there may be additional requirements related to leachate. So that's the package of things that would be done. Part also of what would be done is, as you start looking at, remember we talked under biology at a system-wide or an area-wide open space plan, would be utilizing natural drainage wherever possible, so that you would use wetland areas and wetland vegetation essentially to filter runoff, as opposed to engineered solutions as water's coming out of a pipeline.
Will there be any kind of criteria about the soluble chemicals that's going to be run off into the ocean?
Yes.
Or the lagoon?
Yeah, and so it would look at the issue, particularly the urban runoff.
There's the particulate matter is one thing, but the big main issue is also the chemicals.
It's looking at the quality of the runoff, not just
Yes,
erosion. Any other questions?
I actually did think of one more question. I wanted clarification on a point. So, as we know, there are significant contaminants in both OU1 and OU2, but only a portion of that area was actually literally a landfill. So I was wondering if the landfill closure plan, does that apply to all of OU1 and OU2, or only those portions that were literally a landfill?
Let's go back to that graphic. Unfortunately, we were at the end of the presentation. I went back to the beginning. Oh, there we are. I went right past. Okay, so as looking at this graphic, OU1 and 2 sit on the west side of the site. And so they are in an area separate from the landfill.
Oh, okay. I thought
The landfill
OU2.
is the eastern portion of the site. And so there's not an overlap between them.
Okay, got it. So OU1 and OU2 are or are not part of the landfill closure plan?
They are not.
Okay. So
OU1 and OU2 are the remediation of contaminants within the former Railyard and the industrial areas of the Baylands. The landfill closure deals with the landfill.
Okay.
That's the reason I try not to use the term remediation for the entire site.
Okay, but I also see that there's a label of the Regional Water Quality Control Board by OU2. So is their involvement there only for water quality, or what is their role on that portion of the land?
Yeah, they are there for the remediation of OU2.
Okay.
The determination was made at some point between DTSC and the regional board that in OU1, the primary issue was soil contamination. OU2, you're dealing more with groundwater contamination, and so regulatory authority for OU1 went to DTSC, regulatory authority for OU2 to regional board. The regional board in OU2 is responsible for remediation of the entire site.
So is that,
When I say the entire site, the entirety of OU2.
right. So is that process going to happen at approximately the same time, in that slide where you had the bullet points of the different sequences of events, where the second bullet point was the landfill closure? Is the remediation of OU1 and OU2 going to be happening at that point in time, or is it handled separately?
Yeah, if you're asking about the remediation plans for OU1 as compared to OU2 as compared to Title 27 landfill closure.
The timings thereof.
Yeah, the timing of how that works, that is really up to the landowner and how they process their plans through those agencies. You have the option of making recommendations how that should occur. And if you want to see it at one time, that would be a recommendation you could make, but the agencies will really control the process of how they do those plans.
Right, but my previous question about the timing of the landfill closure versus when we get information versus when we can amend decisions we made or putting off decisions until later, that also applies to OU1 and OU2, even though they're happening in parallel, independent of each other.
Yeah, so it's a similar process laid out in the mitigation measure for all three. remediation, Title 27, landfill closure, specific plan, physical, and your zoning and development planning, actual remediation and closure, and then site-specific development is similar process in that mitigation measure for each of these three areas.
Okay, that's clear now.
Anything else? Thank you.
Thank you, Lloyd. Okay. So again, to remind everyone, if you would like to speak, please help us keep a good running record by filling out a speaker card. So there's no indication here in terms of timing. We're going to try to move the shorter speakers first. So if you have a minute or so, could you kindly come up first? I'm not sure. It's not indicated on these speaker cards, so I don't know who that would be. So if you're guesstimating that you're about a minute or so, please come forward. And we're going to try, as per Commissioner Munir's suggestion, stay with geology first, then hazards and hazardous materials, then hydrology and water quality. Hi.
Hi, I'm Anja Miller, chair of the Citizens Committee that was assigned to review the draft DIR. And we spent a year on that and did our best work on that. And of course now we're all really interested in seeing how those comments that we made are responded to. And so what I've been trying to do myself is to go to the comment that we made, look at the response, and then the response, that's in a different document. And then that often refers to a master response, which is another place in a big document. And a master response may have references to a table or a mitigation list, which are again in a different place in a document. It is so difficult. And people, this would be hard copy back and forth for people who don't have computers. And I've been trying to use the very well prepared, searchable online document. And for me, that doesn't work. You cannot search. The downloading takes forever, and then it stops, and you try to find something, it crashes. My computer crashes. So it's just not very user-friendly. And these hearings are intended to provide the public the opportunity to comment on that document. We have very good, I really appreciate the oral presentation of what's in it, but the actual text is what we want to know. And that is not easy. And so it's really almost a question of legitimacy of these hearings. If the public document is not accessible to the public, you have to consider that. And so people have come here and they say something that's not really or has already been handled in the document, but you can't find everything. So you're going to get a lot of comments that are then going to be dismissed at the end as a final response. So I really question that whole thing. And as far as this question of what's a landfill and what's a not landfill, well, the whole bay land is bayfill. It is filled land. Only the OU1 and OU2 were filled with rubble or something, and the landfill really is the dump. And so again, we have these names that are really not quite up to, OU1 and OU2. Well, they're still bayfill, and that's why you may find things there that are part of the bay mud. So that's my first comment. I'll comment on other things later.
Okay, thank you. Any others around the 1 minute mark? Please come forward if you're in that kind of time mark.
I'm in that time mark, but I wanted to talk about, I guess it's geology water. I'm not exactly sure how this is laid out. So is that appropriate?
Sure.
Just your
All
name.
right, yeah. So I'm Stores Hohen from Sierra Point Road. And the Regional Water Quality Control Board is currently monitoring the groundwater and leaching of the former landfill. And do we have a place? I mean, perhaps this is in the DEIR, and I haven't found it, where those results are summarized versus time, and perhaps in comparison to both other sites that have been remediated and other non-toxic sites, so that we can get a sense of both how the toxins are changing with time and how and whether to get an idea of what level they are relative to what is considered pristine land. From this document, it wasn't clear whether the same monitoring had been done at OU2. They mentioned that there was some testing done at OU2, but it may not necessarily be on the yearly basis. But if it is, it would be really interesting to see the same sorts of analysis. And I mean, this is one of the critical issues about whether these lands are safe for us, right? Thanks.
Thanks, Doris.
Good evening, Carol Zoltowski, Humboldt Road. I don't know if this is the appropriate spot, but what I'm struck with is, and I do appreciate that this land is not primarily considered part of the development area, is the privately owned land of Kinder Morgan and the tank farm. I appreciate that they are probably being monitored for leaching of toxic materials into the groundwater. However, it strikes me as something that we're ignoring as sort of the elephant in the room, that there is an ongoing source of toxic material that we cannot impact because it is not our land, that has access to the very same groundwater supply that is directly affecting those baylands. And that is a comment that I'd like to make that we don't seem to have addressed, and maybe this will come later, but we have not even mentioned in any of the preliminary comments. And I think that's an omission that would really and should be considered as part of the Planning Commission's decision on just how safe this particular land is. Thanks.
I'm sorry, I didn't get your name.
Carol Zoltowski.
Oh.
I'm going to spell it. It's a really good American name. Zoltowski. Thanks.
Great, thank you.
Sorry, I didn't log my name, but Danny Ames, Sierra Point Road. My concern is, let's say the monitoring takes place and all of a sudden there's some sort of disastrous or catastrophic release. What kind of funding or monies are there to deal with that assessment, should that happen in the future? That's all I'd like to say. Thank you.
Okay. Anyone else within the 1 minute mark or guesstimate around there? Please step forward.
Yes, good evening. My name is Fabrizio Settepani. I work for Geosyntec Consultants, and we've been providing preliminary geotechnical design input for the Baylands project for over 10 years. I want to say that development on closed landfills, like the Baylands project, is now commonplace, and some examples of these developments. One is Sierra Point, as the planner explained. The other one is the Home Depot off Highway 280, and then the public uses it, and there haven't been any problems. And I also wanted to say that Geosyntec will likely be involved and will make sure that the applicable regulatory standards from the city of Brisbane and the state of California, as well as our standards, are met. Actually, the reason I came up was because the gentleman asked if there were financial assurance mechanisms, and as part of developing this property, Title 27 of the California Code of Regulations requires financial assurance mechanisms to be in place to address geotechnical environmental issues that may arise in the future. The other thing is that land use covenants will be recorded to continuously monitor and inspect the improvements after completion to ensure that public health is safeguarded. So I guess in conclusion, I would like to emphasize that there is going to be a lot more work that is going to be required as part of the permitting, design, and construction of this project. So it's not that things are not being addressed. Or
Sorry, could you please speak into the mic?
Oh, I'm
Speak
sorry.
up, we can't hear you.
So it's not that the concerns that the gentleman brought up are not going to be addressed.
Okay.
That was all.
Sorry, could you also repeat again who you represent?
Geosyntec, GEOSYNTEC Consultants. And we were one of the consultants that put together the geotechnical report for the site.
Thank you. Anyone else in the 1 minute mark or around there?
Good evening, Madam Chairman and Commissioners. My name is Michael Barnes. I'm a Brisbane resident. There is a 2008 draft leachate management plan, and I'm just reading from the staff report here are the materials from the draft EIR. And the primary method for the long-term leachate management at the Brisbane landfill is to reduce leachate generation through the construction of a low permeability final cover. Construction of the final cover will reduce leachate generation by approximately 90%. And so it just strikes me that while we are all very concerned with what's in the landfill and what might leach out of the landfill, unless we do something, we will continue to have water pollution from the landfill. But if we take an action and actually implement a landfill closure, then we get rid of the problem. Even though the contaminants are still in the landfill, they don't make it to the water. Thank you.
Anyone else?
Good evening, Honorable Planning Commissioners. Joel Diaz. I just wanted to piggyback off of what Michael Barnes just mentioned. And I think he's right in his assessment that, if we don't do something, we're going to continue to have a leaching problem. And I think that the bigger problem for me is that the according to the developer, from what I've read, the goal is to begin developing in 2035, which is 20 years from now, which means it's going to be an ongoing problem for the next, presumably the next 20 years. And, short of that, short of some other alternative, that's 20 years that we can count on for nothing to be done. And so it seems important to identify all of the alternatives and to see if maybe there is a faster solution to fix the problem. And my question, the biggest question I have is how is all of this economically feasible? Because I don't see any cost analysis to know what the cost of all of these things are, the cleaning of the soil, the site stability, the long-term maintenance plan for any subsidence. And if this stuff is infeasible, it seems that we should look at the alternatives. And again, with the alternatives, if we don't have a cost analysis, how do we know how economically feasible they are? And as I understand it from the previous city attorney, Hal Topple, is that economic feasibility is a criteria for the alternatives in this plan. And so it seems to me we should have that information so that we can make a better informed decision about the alternatives at our disposal so that we don't have to wait 20 plus years to clean up this problem. I think renewable energy is a viable alternative. And I think if we understood the cost of the cleanup, the cost of the infrastructure, the Geneva overpass, all of these things, we could compare that to renewable energy and determine which is more feasible, which is superior. But we don't have that cost analysis information. Additionally, with the addition of the potential for HSR, renewable energy also becomes more feasible. And so in order to make that alternative more understandable, it seems reasonable to include the potential for HSR in the renewable energy solution. And in the EIR, the HSR is showing the east side, the landfill, as being their desirable site. So presumably they would clean up that site and they would do a lot of this work for us sooner.
Hold on. Can I just ask a question? When you say that the renewable energy is a viable alternative, are you talking about the plan that is the alternative plan, or are you talking about actually taking the whole area and putting renewable energy? I'm just a little confused about what you were saying.
I think it's unclear because we don't have the cost analysis information.
Okay.
And we don't have enough information from HSR on how that would change the renewable energy alternative. So I think it's important for us to have that information so that we can compare the proposal and the alternatives to determine which are more feasible in terms of remediation, the cost of remediation, who's going to do it, when they're going to do it, and thereby figure out which is the superior alternative. Thank you.
Thank you. Is that it for the kind of the 1 minute mark? Okay, 3 minutes. Please step forward.
Good evening, Madam Chair, Commissioners. Jonathan Scharfman. I represent Universal Paragon, the applicant. And I have some general comments, and my colleagues will address some specific separate areas as has already occurred on the remediation, geotechnical, and flooding water quality. First, just to correct the record, I would like to ask Mr. Zola to double check his first slide, at which I characterize, I believe, I saw it mention that that there was hydrocarbon pollution in OU1. Our understanding, and I'm not an engineer, is that the hydrocarbon pollution that's been studied for many, many years on this site is in fact in OU2 and not in OU1. So I'd ask to just check the record on that. Second, to correct what I believe I understood as a comment in a previous hearing on location of proposed housing in the applicant's what's called the DSP. Housing is not proposed on the landfill. It is proposed in the OU1 area primarily, and there's a smaller amount of housing proposed of the overall proposal in the OU2 area. And third, I just have for the record, our intent is to begin development of this property as soon as it is financially and from a regulatory standpoint feasible to proceed, however long that takes. And we've already been at this process. The first notice of preparation for this EIR was in March 2006. Regarding geotech and geotechnical and hazardous material remediation, we really, while we respect the very serious concerns in the community and perhaps from some of the commissioners about the seriousness of the contamination, we do reject the claim that that by some that this site can never be safely developed. It's simply it's not ours to determine. UPC or any other developer that may get involved in this site in the future has to follow regulatory requirements on hazardous materials remediation that are set by state agencies. We're doing exactly that on an adjacent site, the former Schlegel Lock site, under an approved remedial action plan by the DTSC, which followed a project EIR certification that laid out many exactly the same issues that are before you and have been before you for years. So the remedial action plan, based on the summaries and the extensive studies of the environmental impact report, in this case in the adjacent Schlegel Lock site, set that standard for the DTSC to have their remedial action plan and all the various studies and requirements that follow that. And on the majority of that site, active remediation is now complete, and the funding mechanisms for monitoring are in place as required. And construction is to begin later this year, beginning next year. Second, just for people to know that our environmental and civil engineering team, just the members of the team that are sitting in this room, have over 100 years collective experience designing, constructing, and monitoring environmental and geotechnical mitigations for areas that are very similar to this, including the Sierra Point in your own jurisdiction, a former landfill itself. And so on, finally, just to provide some context, adjacent sites, again, including one in your own jurisdiction, that your citizens play, work, and have meals on, is under the same regulatory, was developed under the same regulatory regime for landfill closure that would be set for this site. Schlegel Lock site I mentioned, and Mission Bay in San Francisco had many of the same issues that you have reviewed for years. It was a former Railyard. There were hydrocarbons on that site. There were volatile organic compounds on that site. There were major bay fill and other serious geotechnical issues on that site. It was a former tidal flats where Mission Creek came into the bay, much like Visitation Creek comes into the bay through the baylands. Most of us have raised our children laying down in those areas, playing in those parks. Some of us in this room work there. Many thousands of people live there. These are under the same regulatory regimes that are set by the same agencies that would review this project. And I just want that to be under the record. UPC or anybody that comes after us would follow these same standards. So please, 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 while we respect that this is an emotional issue, people are very concerned when it comes to public health and safety, we cannot move forward with any development that isn't under these strict regulatory requirements. And we have, in fact, done so on an adjacent site, and we would intend to do so here. And just, I'll have more to say in subsequent hearings, but I just would like to set that context and appreciate your hearing my comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else within the 3-minute mark?
Well, if that was 3 minutes, I think I can stay within that length of time. I don't know what the plan was for...
Sorry, could you state your name for the record?
I'm sorry, my name is Mary Gudekanst. I live in
Hi,
Brisbane.
Mary.
I don't know what the plan was for these hearings, but it was my understanding that the applicant was going to have, like, half of a hearing to talk. And if each one of these guys is going to get up, every time there's a hearing, then I think that interferes with the public's ability to be heard. And so I think you want to rethink, or maybe Jonathan wants to rethink how many people are going to talk in how many hearings. I thought that the presentation was pretty light on the issues of groundwater in the Baylands in general. It's a bigger issue than can be handled by the leachate collection system. There are some areas where leachate has been identified as going into the lagoon and into Visitation Creek. But it's perfectly plausible and likely that leachate is entering the bay and the lagoon below the water line, and that is not being measured. One of the reasons that I particularly wanted to see testing done of the lagoon was to provide a baseline. It seems to me that you don't know what the effects of activities have been unless you know what was the situation before the activities commenced, and what's the situation going to be afterwards. Certainly, it's not just UPC or not just the dump and the OU1 and OU2 that have contributed to contamination in the lagoon. Certainly Kinder Morgan has. Certainly VWR has. And I hope we're going to learn a lot more about VWR, and I hope there will be sampling in the lagoon as the investigation of the contamination at the old VWR facility goes forward. But in general, it just seems it seems very inadequate to me that there are activities being recommended or activities being considered right around the lagoon, that people fish in the lagoon. I guess the reason why there's been no sampling of the lagoon sediments and the lagoon water itself is that people don't want to. Is that the people who could do the sampling don't want to know. But I think we want to know. I think citizens of Brisbane want to know, and I really think that that's something that's missing in the program here. One of the questions that came up when Mr. Zola was giving his excellent presentations about the CEQA process was, and it wasn't from me, it was and I don't remember, I'm going to paraphrase the question. The question essentially was, what guarantee do we have as the citizens of Brisbane that the cleanup of the Baylands will incorporate the best available technologies and the most effective available techniques? And Mr. Zola said, you have none. There is no such guarantee. And in fact, there is no such projection that remediation measures would incorporate the best available technology. It's all good enough. That's the goal. Good enough to meet the standards that have been set in a political process. The state of California has established standards for different chemicals, what constitutes a hazard and what needs to be cleaned up under different use characterizations. And those were developed with the input from lobbyists, with input from developers, with input from lots of people who aren't scientists, and definitely lots of people who aren't medical doctors. And so I think it's important to realize that all these safeguards, all these marvelous programs that DTSC and the Regional Water Quality Control Board outline or approve are not, do not go to the extent that I think people in Brisbane would like to see done. Mr. Scharfman rejected the claim that the baylands cannot be safely developed. Well, I think there are safety is a relative term. I think there are certainly uses on the baylands that would be relatively safe and acceptably safe. However, it is true that the baylands will be toxic forever. That is the truth. Can the community and the bay and wildlife, different organisms be protected from the toxins that are going to remain in the baylands forever? Well, that's really the issue. And I think that's the main issue that you want to consider in considering uses of the baylands. Those toxins aren't going to go away. The proposal essentially is to just cover them up and hope that they don't leak out, and then, you know, every few years you'll notice something leaking out and then you'll fix it. So I think you want to reduce the number of people who spend a lot of time out there, and certainly I think that the baylands use as a rail yard for high-speed rail and for and its use as a renewable energy hub would be very appropriate. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else around that, Mark?
I wanted to address one of the comments. I think it is a great benefit that we have the applicant here, and I wouldn't want to silence them. However, I'd also like to remind the applicant that we've read their DEIR, and we know their opinion. So if they'd like to come up and perhaps correct any mistakes they see in the slides, that would be great. But I mean, primarily tonight, we'd like to hear the opinion of the public. Thank you.
Clara?
No, wait. He's coming.
Oh.
Byron Anderson, San Bruno Avenue. A message, I don't know about you guys, but a pretty consistent message that I've seen is we're going to do the minimum. Like, I agree with Mayor on that point. Like, we're going to do what the state, the U.S. requires, or the California requires. And not only is it just the minimum, but from what I've heard, the U.S. isn't the strictest about its environmental stuff, so that there's that too. So it's, and they're comparing it to Schleglock, and just because someone else does something bad doesn't mean you have to follow. I mean, these are two things that they teach you since about like kindergarten. Don't do the minimum, and just because someone else does something bad doesn't mean you should do it too.
Thank you.
Clara Johnson. I'm a member of the BBCAG. I'm here representing myself. But in the BBCAG, both DTSC and Regional Water Quality Control Board have stated that they need to know what the use the land will be put to before they can determine the level of cleanup that will be required. The highest cleanup is required of residential use. And I think that there's it seems like that's not presented to you quite in that way. And so I wanted to make that clarification. And you could certainly invite their representatives here to check on that. I'd like to start with the master response and master response number 12. Regarding best science and its use here, the maximum credible earthquake is questioned by a seismologist at Caltech, and she believes that an 8.0 Richter earthquake is possible. The San Francisco 1906 earthquake was a 7.9. Caution, I think, is called for, and therefore an 8.0 should be used as, on the Richter scale, should be used as the maximum credible earthquake. On page 2.4.36 in the second paragraph, there's an error in numbering to the mitigation that's referred to as should be 4.E-4B instead of 4E-40. The reference to 4.E minus 2 minus dash 2A and 4.E-2B related to strong seismic shaking associated with the project site development would be reduced to less than significant levels. There's no justification for saying that shaking would be a less than significant level. What does significant mean when discussing shaking? There will be tremendous shaking in buildings built on 50 to 200 feet of bay mud, overlain with fill or refuse fill, and in some cases the refuse is infiltrated by bay water. If you really want to know about shaking, then use a shake table. Have them pay for a shake table. You'd get the impacts if you feed in all the variables. It would help designers to get it right. The California Building Code of 2013 or later should be used to get benefit of more seismic safety. It should be adopted in Brisbane if it isn't already. On page 2.4-37, it states that the City of Brisbane does not have the authority to set remediation standards, implying that we don't have control over our fate. In an earlier EIR, a non-planning commission session, Lloyd Zola stated that if the City of Brisbane requires a higher standard, then it requires a finding by the city and substantial evidence, presumably to support it. An example of substantial evidence would be obtaining a recommendation of a governmental entity, such as the State Office of Emergency Services. So there is a way. Page 2.4-38, there aren't any mitigations addressing compliance with Title 27. There must be something needed, at least methods of coordination with other regulators and assurance that it has been complied with. The remediation proposals on OU1 and OU2 are just that. They have not been approved. I believe that there's an exception to that in OU1, but the work on that is not entirely complete, and that's been implied here, and I'm positive that it's wrong on OU2, and I believe it's still incorrect on OU1. Their list has 6 items in it on that page, and the number 1 is arbitrary. Who knows how much dirt will be needed to be excavated. Number 2 is not approved yet. Number 3 is not a remediation. And number 4, 5, and 6 on that page don't show any real information. On page 2.4-39, there are only proposed mitigations on OU2. There is no indication of the adequacy of the proposal. So these things are not finished, and they're not even on OU2, they're not even completely figured out as to what the remediation would be. Table 3-6 The items in that table are not proved by regulators. They have not been found adequate. They are simply proposals. Page 2.4.40 to 43. The human risk assessment should be made readily available to the Planning Commission and the City Council. There is a human risk assessment from 2007. The date could be 06, or I'm pretty sure it's 07, but it is out of date. The Planning Commission and the City Council need to make recommendations and decisions now, not later. It is nonsense to say that you have to approve a project before you know what the risk of the presence of particular chemicals in specific amount means to human health. If that were true, that would make the process of determining impacts a complete farce. You need at least to know what is there and how much of it is there. You perhaps cannot yet know all the other details because you don't know what all the uses will be. But parts of it you can know and should know. Page 2.4-45, second paragraph. The environmental studies have not been as complete and thorough as they should have been. When a study reported the presence of a chemical or metal of concern, it didn't turn up in the next study. These are environmental studies. It was ignored and not thoroughly investigated, nor was the lack of investigation justified. Some studies are too old and should be redone. The entire area of each operational unit of 1 and 2 and the landfill should be accounted for in the studies. The goal is the protection of human health and environmental quality. We must apply caution to allow a margin of error. In the mitigation and monitoring and reporting plan, page 4-43, mitigation measure 4.E-2A, a peer review is needed, performed by a similarly qualified independent, no connection to the city, the developer, or ESA, geotechnical engineer before the submission to the city engineer's review. In the same volume, the Mitigation and Monitoring Report, page 4-44, the licensed geotechnical or soils engineer monitoring of earthwork and construction activities should occur frequently, and at least for the duration of the first 10% of the work, and then following that, there should be times such as 25, 50, 75, and 100%. At those levels of completion, there should be more review. I believe that often geotechnical engineers come and they stay for a rather limited amount of time. By providing more time for them to see what's going on, you're assured that it's closer to the design that was made. The Mitigation Monitoring Report 4.45, the post-earthquake inspection should be implemented at a 6.0 Richter earthquake when that occurs within 30 miles because of the fill, the bay mud, the saturated soils, and the liquefaction potential. Mitigation Measure 4.E-3, the final design level geotechnical investigation recommendations should comply with the California Building Code 2013 or later. There were changes made that were based, I don't know the whole story, but there were changes made that were based on the LA City Code that was put in place after the Northridge earthquake of 1994. It also should require a peer review in this section as in 4.E-2A. The Mitigation and Monitoring Report, page 4-46, measure 4.E-4A, slope stability. There needs to be standards for the exceptions to the 600-foot lagoon protection distance that's been determined, so that it is actually protected. And one of those exceptions is road building, which seems, of course, quite necessary, but if it undermines the whole process that we're trying to accomplish, then I think there should be standards applied to it. Also, the Building Code of 2013 or later should be used. The manufactured slope certification should be peer-reviewed, and the maximum credible earthquake should be 8.0 on the Richter. The factor of safety should be conservative and should be more clearly expressed for the public. Mitigation measure 4.E-4B, use Building Code 2013 or later. Final design and engineering plans should be peer-reviewed by an independent geotechnical engineer before review by the building official or the city engineer. This conservative approach protects public safety. Mitigation measure 4.G-2A. The title of the significant impact being mitigated is incomplete. We're dealing with the remediation of toxic contamination to a statutorily acceptable level. That isn't mentioned. The disposal of hazardous waste, which is what is in the title, that's something else. It's defined statutorily as something else. So I'm not sure why it's organized that way, but it's kind of misleading. The mitigation report, page 4-47, the amount of grading needed to remediate needs to be approximately quantified by DTSC or Regional Water Quality Control Board, which they would do so if you asked them, if they haven't already done it in some form. And the reason for this would be to avoid a temptation by the developer to call grading for other purposes remediation grading. The regulator imposed remedial action plans or final closure and post-closure maintenance plans must be communicated loudly and clearly to the city, including what the limitations, conditions, and deed restrictions are on the land, in order to protect the public in the future. The long-term monitoring plan must also be studied by the city for all the operational units and its implication understood for land use planning. There is a myth that this land will be pristine clean when the remediation is finished. Rather, it will mean that the land will have the contamination reduced to meet statutory requirements that were arrived at by compromise that included human health, environmental quality, and corporate interest in the equation. When a review of chemicals or of concern takes place, the standard of exposure is often lowered. Many chemicals have not been examined for their toxicity to humans and organisms in the environment. There are potential unknown threats by chemicals that may be present. That is why we should apply a precautionary principle in decisions that will expose other people, including children, to potentially harmful locations. From the mitigation report, 4-48, for OU1, OU2, and the landfill, there should be a yearly review of the chemicals of concern known to be present to determine if the maximum contaminant level is proposed to be lowered or has been lowered. If that occurs, the DTSC or Regional Water Quality Control Board should be contacted for recommendations and to find out what is required of them in that circumstance. Monitoring results should be readily available to the public every year. If a chemical that is present in OU2, OU1, or the landfill has been added to the list of chemicals of concerns or metals of concern, then testing and monitoring must be done to determine if levels exceed the maximum contaminant level. On a contaminated site, EPA requires a 5-year review to update the type and level of contamination and an update of the remediation efforts. The yearly review would assist regulators and the city in making a standard 5-year review by having data available at the onset of the 5th year, and if it would provide the ability to think about the significance of the data for a better result. These activities could be funded by a Mello-Roos district, funded by property owners within the district. That would be for a district for safety and mitigation of hazards. Mitigation report, page 4-49. Refer to G. Fred Lee's report, which is in the DEIR, that talks about the prospect of chemicals that have not been researched for their toxicity on humans and the environment being present, but nothing's being done about them at the moment. Mitigation report, page 4-50, mitigation manager 4.G-2B, the soil and groundwater management plan. There's a potential for gaps. I previously referred to the need to list all COCs and metals of concern ever found on the site. There also should be a careful examination of the geologic and hydrologic conditions and the geology of each OU because they differ from each other. There also a reference was made to OU2. My understanding is that the OU1 hydrology is well understood, in the opinion of the people making that statement, and the hydrology of OU2 is not so well understood.
Clara, I'm sorry. When you finished with that point, I want to go back to you were saying that you wanted the Melrose district could be formed, and I'd like to hear more about that.
That's a funding mechanism to pay for ongoing maintenance and other issues and related to safety and hazard mitigation. It could be used to help pay for a lot of these ongoing issues that don't have a funding mechanism otherwise. And the EIR does refer to the need for a funding mechanism. This would be one paid for by the property owners in that area, in the Baylands, not by the public.
Okay, and the Melrose district that you're saying would be really helpful, is that set up how, by a board, by regional agencies?
It would be set up through the city, I think, and with the cooperation of the property owners.
Okay.
It wouldn't really...
And it would be
everything should always coordinate with other people who have jurisdiction, but no, it wouldn't. You could discuss that with them. I'm sure they would be interested because they don't fund. They count on the developers to fund the remediation.
Okay, so the Melrose district that you're speaking of would be for the total development, so that each section would maybe have a board and then.
No, there's one district, and
one district,
and there's one board.
And that's set up by the city or by the people who live there? I
think you probably would want to ask for accurate and thorough details. You would want to ask the city staff about the Melrose district, but it would be. You could certainly recommend it. The city council would approve it, and that would begin the process of forming it. The Melrose district is something that's available under state law, in order to accomplish some goal within a specific area.
Okay, so most of the districts that are in contaminated area have a Melrose, or do you know?
I don't know.
You don't know?
This was something suggested by the partner of Mary Hashem of Brownfield Partners. Mm-hmm. And we were asking her question at the BBCAG, how can we make sure that these things are done? How can we make sure there's money for these to be paid for? And this was a suggestion that she gave us. And I think it has great merit.
Okay. So I think of all the things you've suggested now, that one really kind of pops up as being something that we haven't really looked at and talked about. So I just wanted to make sure that we talked about that, because that sounds very significant as far as what you're saying. Is there anything more about the Melrose that you want to say?
No, I'm afraid I don't have more right now. I probably could get you more information if you'd like. I know in the EIR there's mention of using a lighting and landscaping district like the one they have out at Sierra Point to fund certain things. But there's a huge need for a safety and hazards mitigation on this acreage. And so I think that the Melrose is a better way to go.
Okay, so at Sierra Point, you're saying there's a lighting and
landscaping district. It's part of the city budget every year, and
district
funded by the property owners on Sierra Point.
So this Melrose would be funded by the property owners?
That's who it's, yes.
Okay, so what you're saying is the Melrose district could be formed, funded by the, to be property owners.
Right.
And it would set up and oversee to make certain that the toxic hazards that were set up would be monitored, or what?
But the mitigations that the city of Brisbane and the conditions that the city of Brisbane impose on the project are funded, and that what was considered safety and hazard mitigation, I think, would be something that the city probably would decide. I think there is a political aspect of this. If you set up this kind of a district, there's a little bit of a and then I'd be interested in anybody who disagrees with this, because I'd like to learn about it. A diminution, I don't know, that the power of the city council would be somewhat truncated with relation to these issues, because the district is an overlay on the city, and all the legality of that I don't know. But that when this was maybe mentioned to them, I wasn't so sure they were interested in it, and I wondered if that was why. But there may be a lot of other issues that I'm simply not aware of.
I don't disagree, but we haven't seen the financial plan yet.
Right.
And so I think maybe we should reserve discussion of that until that time and use this.
I can tell you for sure there isn't a funding mechanism, because it says so in your EIR that
Yes,
there
I
is
know.
not one.
We haven't seen the plan yet.
It's a fiscal analysis, and I've been asking for it since 2009, and I haven't seen it, and I'm very curious if you wanted to ask your staff when the public will get
We've often asked the staff when the financial plan is going to be available, and we strongly agree with you, but it's not our discussion point for tonight.
Okay, so getting back to the Melrose district, this has come up for the very first time. No one's discussed it. Do you know of another, when you're talking about that, do you know of another area that's had Melrose?
There are many Melrose districts, but and there are different kinds of them.
Yeah,
right. Okay, thank you very much.
And this is at economic, when we have the economic report.
Oh, okay. We could go back then.
Thank you.
On page 450, mitigation manager 4.G-2B, I think there's a gap in the soil and groundwater management plan. I previously told you about the need to list all COCs and metals of concern, but there should also be an examination of the geologic and hydrologic conditions and of each OU and how they differ from each other, because the studies that were done, we were told they are different. So there needs to be a great understanding of that. And excavation can alter the path of groundwater, which in this location would carry contamination to new areas.
Okay.
I've seen that happen, and it was on a very small scale. Nothing compared to this, so this seems like it almost would be certain to happen somewhere on such a large site. There should be standards among the protocols for excavation of refuse and its relocation. The emphasis should be on recycling waste that can be, and determining if what is dug up is something that should be in a Class 3 landfill for hazardous items like asbestos. On the remediation plan, page 4-51, mitigation measure 4G-2C, the demolition and hazard section, there should be a consultation with a DTSC and Regional Water Control Board about the issue of the demolition of buildings that may contain hazardous materials. For example, at the foundations of those buildings, sometimes you don't have a building, but you have a foundation. For example, the workshops on the Railyard, the building that held Stauffer Chemical, and the other area that's particularly a concern is the building that held a tannery that's near Industrial Way. And there may be remains of the Champion Raceway, which has a lot of hydrocarbons, I imagine. And I just think when you're looking for these things, that there should be an effort to try to take them out of the area if it's necessary. Would you like me to give up my time and come back for the rest of the pages?
I think that'd be a good idea.
That would be great. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll stop there for now.
And I hope that you will submit in writing again. It was very, very helpful. I appreciate all of your comments, and it's great to have them in writing.
Thank you. I will. I'll get the ones that are not available to you.
Thank you, Claire.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, any speakers around the 3-minute stage?
Greetings this evening, Barbara Ebel. I don't think I'm actually in the 3-minute range, but I just had a couple of notes I wanted to pull forward for your consideration from this section. One of the notes is that approximately 50% of the waste in the landfill is believed to be below the water table. And I thought that that's really important because when it talks about on page 36, paragraph 2, improvements to the foundation soil such as compaction and densification and compactions of soils is typically accomplished through explosion, vibration, and impacts. The issues of soil and then, sorry, skip that part. So when that starts happening, that's going to really change the hydrology of what's happening on below there. And I'm just, even Sierra Point, I mean, they're talking about Sierra Point not having problems. They have problems. They have problems with subsidence there. And so once you're densifying and you're compacting and you're changing the subsurface hydrology, and you put the weight of these massive buildings on there, I think you're going to see an increase in leachate, despite the fact that there will be a cap on it, so there won't be rainwater penetration. And also with sea level rise, if 50% of it is underwater now, and you tamp it all down, and then the ocean is higher, maybe 100% of it is going to end up being in contact with groundwater. So I'm not a scientist. I can't prove that. That's just supposition based on common sense and logic. But I wanted you to consider it. Thank you.
Thanks, Barbara. Tony Varios, very short question. Thanks, Sean.
Tony Varios, Warbler, 122 Warbler. My question is, since the Dr. Mearns, I believe, is only going to be here tonight, I wanted to see whether or not it's possible to hear from the doctor, because we haven't heard from her specifically. She's now listened to a number of comments that I think she could respond to. I'd certainly like to know what she's got to say, because I don't want to make a judgment just on a lot of speculation. My concern is that we all know how the bay got polluted, and that it's still being polluted today. We understand a lot of the different sources of pollution that we have, not exactly as well as a scientist, how they all, to what extent they move and what's going to happen. But it seems to me that since the landfill it was not a big concrete bowl that was created to contain anything. And even in those cases where I've read about that process being done, every single one of them supposedly leaks. So I'm not sure if that's a scientifically correct statement that I just made, but I'd like to hear from the doctor on that. And since that's not what's going to happen, and prior speaker just mentioned that a number of factors that can increase the movement of liquid under the soils, in addition to the possibility of liquefaction that was also mentioned earlier due to earthquake. I'd like to know what the doctor's got to say about all of that, because maybe Well, I don't want anyone to speculate. I just want to hear. Thank you very much.
Just a technical question. Would it be appropriate to do this after the public hearing? Or should we address it immediately?
I would see how many more speakers you have, and probably would prefer to defer until after the public testimony.
Thank you.
Hello.
Hi.
My name is John Christopher Burr, and I'm proud to be a lifelong resident of Brisbane. I think, first of all, I'd like to talk a little bit about the process that was selected here. I think it was unwieldy from the very beginning, and it's taken off. You're biting off a lot when you're trying to process a general plan amendment, plus a specific plan, plus an EIR, plus a project that's huge, all at once. And so that really is a very difficult sort of thing to do. And if you look at what some professionals anyway, at the state level, recommend you don't do that. You don't take on projects like this because you're probably going to wind up with a document that's unlawful. Now, a lot of you probably know, being planning commissioners, that the general plan is your constitution. It's the land use documents that everything falls under, everything is subservient to the general plan. Zoning, specific plans, precise plans, everything is lower than the general plan. The general plan rules all. And in this case, in Brisbane's case, this particular general plan is very special because the public voted for it. They voted to no housing out there on the toxic waste dump because they understand that there's a problem there. We can have all these consultants come in and say, all these wonderful things, pretend it's not toxic. I remember I went to one meeting, and the consultants came in and actually said, oh, it's like chocolate chip cookies out there. There's these little chocolate chip, these little pockets of contamination. It's just, we can't crump this later, And it was an insult to the people who were there, but they didn't get it. They didn't understand, and they didn't even bother going out to look at the dump site. But what we have here, what this site was, it's been mentioned, it actually started being filled with rubble, including asbestos-laden building materials after the 2006 earthquake. So it's really been a dump, go over the border, go right over the border of San Francisco and just start dumping it because, they couldn't dump in San Francisco, but they could come to Brisbane and dump. Anyway, so it went on for many, many years, and people also fail to realize how industrialized San Francisco was. It was very, very heavy industry here. Giant foundries, steel mills, everything was here. And the entire industrial waste stream came to Little Brisbane. The entire medical waste stream came to Little Brisbane. The entire military waste stream came to Brisbane. And the household hazardous waste that came to Brisbane is enough to gag a maggot. So, let's not kid ourselves. This is some really serious pollution out here. And it also never fails to amaze me how, a lot of laws start off pretty good, and then they might work for about 10 years or so before the lawyers start tearing them apart. It used to be that the preferred methodology of attacking one of these Superfund sites, which is seriously polluted and very dangerous, was to remove the toxins and take them away to a proper dump site, like Utah or someplace like that. And if they did that here, of course, many of us would argue, well, let's turn it back to the bay because it was really stolen from the public to begin with. Those were navigable waters. They were unlawfully filled. So, we have a public trust claim there, too. Anyway, So you have this unregulated dump, and it took everything. It took Agent Orange. I remember as a kid seeing giant mounds of car batteries, lead-acid car batteries, and giant mountains of tires which contain vinyl chloride, a known carcinogen. And I brought this up at meetings here, and they just want to shine on, pretend it didn't happen, you know. And I also mentioned, you know, unfortunately our old fire chief died just the other day, and but when he was on the council, whenever I told this little part of my story, he would nod up and down because he remembered it. And what happened was, during one of the many tire fires they used to mysteriously have out there, incidentally, those tires would burn the ground for months and years at a time. Some of them may still be burning, for all we know. Anyway, they were out there fighting the tire fire, the giant mound of tires on fire, and they had a giant D6 bulldozer. I think it's a D6. Anyway, it's a big one, a big Caterpillar. And they were fighting the tire, and it's still out there. It's sunk into the toxic ooze, and it's still out there to this very day. They couldn't get it out. So that's, you know, that's a pretty goofy site to try to claim that there's not much wrong with it. Earlier, I heard mention of a so-called specific plan. Now, if there was reference to the document I saw earlier, I would call it more properly a concept proposal for new legislation, because under the law, a specific plan has to meet certain requirements. There are certain things it has to have in it. For one thing, it has to be consistent with our general plan. You know, remember I told you it rules, and here we have a proposal that is not even close. It's illegal under our current law. What they're proposing is illegal. You know, let's be clear about that. And they're asking the public to change the law just for them. You know, so not everybody gets that. They have no right to ask for that. So there's no claim of right. You know, it's whether you feel like it. That's how legislation is. You have complete discretion to pass it or not. And that means also that the public can vote on it too, which they did in the past on the general plan. Anyway, I call it a concept proposal for new legislation because, interestingly enough, the part I was really worried about was how they're going to finance the infrastructure, which will be a nightmare. And they kind of let that out of their specific plan because I believe they hope to utilize the rip-off system of the redevelopment agencies, which have now been made illegal, fortunately. But it looked to me like they were trying to avoid that topic completely because they didn't want to pay for it. And that's supposed to be in a specific plan. Where's the financing? When are things going to be built? What's the schedule? Who's going to pay for it? You know, the timing and everything's supposed to be laid out. And what they presented was a bunch of nonsense, a bunch of junk, and just kind of this grandiose idea of let's put this giant development in Brisbane on this toxic waste dump and let's put some houses there soon. Hopefully we'll have all our money in our pockets and be overseas before anybody wises up. And that's my understanding here too, is the principle behind this company can't even set foot in this country because of problems with the law. That's pretty scary. So how are you going to do business with a guy like that where he won't even show up to go to court or you know, even sign a contract with you or even have a cup of coffee, for Christ's sakes? You know, this is kind of a weird situation. And if he doesn't trust our country enough to step foot in it, I mean, you know, why is he asking us to do anything for him? I mean, you know, it just doesn't make sense. So we have a proposal for new legislation. Once again, we don't have to grant it. Now, I heard earlier, too, this idea that DTSC, the Department of Toxic Substances Control, or the Regional Water Board, has jurisdiction over this, and Brisbane has no say. and can't regulate this area. That's simply false. As a matter of fact, under our law, a government agency cannot. They're prohibited from bargaining away or giving away what's known as the police power. And what is the police power? The police power is simply the power to enact laws for health, education, welfare, safety, that kind of thing. So that's where our zoning laws come from. That's where all our ordinances come from. That's where the existence of the city itself comes from, basically an exercise of the police power. So what is the police power? Well, hey, if you got a toxic waste dump, maybe you want to abate it. Maybe you want to declare it a nuisance and have it hauled away. Maybe you want to pass some laws. And the other reason I thought there was sort of a joke talking about the DKSC and the Regional Water Quality Board as if they do anything valuable. I knew a guy who worked for the Regional Board, and he liked to refer to their NEPDIS permit, which is a National Pollution Elimination Discharge System or something like that. Some lovely an acronym, like a military kind of thing. Well, anyway, he said it really should be called a permit to further pollute already polluted waters. That's what it really should be called, because that's what it is. But it has this nice sounding name. So what the Regional Board is doing is they're just stamping out permits and letting people pollute. And when I went up to Sacramento and met with the head of the Department of Toxic Substance Control one time with a group of spirited citizens, we wanted to know why he wouldn't lift a finger to help his own brother who lived in Benicia and had all this toxic ooze leaking out of his house into his yard. And he wouldn't do anything about it. In fact, he claimed that we don't know what it is. He made that claim for like 5 or 6 months. But it was clear what it was. You could analyze it. It was a chemical coming from the oil, the legacy polluters in the area. And that's another reason that we have really weak laws. We've had the oil companies. Remember I said laws work for about 10 years or so? Well, they've been working on these laws for a long time, chipping away at them. And they don't want to spend the money to actually dig up and remove this toxic pollution and haul it away to someplace safe. What they want to do is say, let's just cover it over and put a Band-Aid on it and leave it there. And that's like cheaper for us. So, and if it leaks or whatever, that's hopefully we'll be gone. We don't know. And that's the way big corporations act. We know it. This is the way PG&E acts. This is the way the oil companies act. This is the way they don't act. It's all about the money. And they don't give a damn about Brisbane or our citizens here. They just want to make some money, and they don't care if they wreck our town or leave us bankrupt, because I foresee, multi-million dollar, billion-dollar liability stemming from this area when the toxic tort lawyers get a hold of some case. It was some kid with 3 eyes and a glowing heart or something. That's not as far-fetched as it seemed. The original order that came out of the state of California, they issued a substantial endangerment order some time ago, but they said that, there are chemicals out there that could cause teratogens. And what that is a mutant baby. And that was the word that the state of California used, teratogen. You gotta file that away in your head, because that's the kind of stuff that's out there. Now, when I was a kid, Clark Conway and I, and a lot of other people who lived here, would see what actually got dumped out there, too. I mentioned the tires and the batteries, but they was bringing tanker trucks full of solvents, just let it rip. Paint, lead paint, with all this stuff. You name it, it's there. Agent Orange, everything that you can imagine. Needles from the hospitals, dirty needles. Just, lovely stuff to have kids playing and go dig in the dirt, because they always do that. And, have it wave together. Now, another bad thing, too, about our regulations, which are a joke in this country, if you have it come up almost to the level that they say is dangerous, but it's just below, and then you have another chemical that comes just below, and then another chemical that's just below, and another, and you mix it all together, well, they don't handle that. That's not a problem for them. And how many chemicals do you think we regulate in this country? 1,200, roughly? 1,500, like that? All stemming from the 70s. That's how up-to-date our law is. Whereas Europe regulates 80,000 chemicals. And they put the burden on the industry to prove that it's safe. We do it the opposite. We make the government prove that it's unsafe. And so there are delays and delays and delays of getting anything effective done. And most importantly here, I think you should remember this part too. Remember I mentioned that the citizens voted on this? Well, they'd like to vote on it again. And it's been promised to us that we get to vote on this Tuntex proposal. The citizens of Brisbane get to vote on it. And we want that vote. Because I know how the people who know what's out there will vote. They'll be sensible. And, it's interesting, too. When SP owns it, SP is no, lovely corporate citizen. They're out to grab as much money as they can, just like the next one. But when they had sense enough not to try to build on it. Think about that for a second. SP, right, Real Estate Corporation, just sat on it because they knew it was a time bomb. It's awful. And it's a crime that it never was allowed to happen in the first place. It's just simply a crime. And we don't need to compound that crime and pretend it's not toxic. How about this argument that we need more shopping in Brisbane? Oh, we need more shopping. Well, maybe they forget that Candlestick is going to turn into a giant shopping center. There's going to be houses all over the place around here. There's going to be a lot of development around here. Well, you're not going to have to go far to go to shopping if you want more shopping. And, our planners seem like they're kind of stuck in, the 70s or something, thinking retail sales, retail, retail. We need more retail. Do you want bigger retail, or gigantic retail? That's in big box. This is how they think. And they're not realizing that there's been a massive shift in our economy, and people aren't going to those places. Those places are boarding up. Mom and pops and brick and mortar places are maybe a thing of the past. Everybody's buying it on the internet now, and you can have it delivered to your house. So shopping isn't really a good argument. Well, how about you get to have a toxic high school? High school. Well, that's not really a good argument either. What about a library? Oh, we get to have a library if we go along and sell out our town. What little baubles can we get? A library? A high school? No, I don't think so. I don't think Brisbane would sell out for that. Would wreck their town for that. Would undertake to go into partnership with this guy who won't even set foot in our country. Essentially he wants us to be his partner, right? Help build the infrastructure, and then when there's problems, I'm going to want you guys to pay for it too, of course, and I'll come up with things at this time, it doesn't pencil out or whatever, but you know how this works. Yeah, you didn't get to be a billionaire by giving away his money. You got to be a billionaire by accumulating it and holding on to it. If you still got $1 billion, I don't know. Maybe not. Anyway, I appreciate your time. Oh, one last thing I want to mention here. Here's a little article. It says, chemical permeating bay seals. So it's getting into little baby seals, this chemical. And the scientists were all baffled. How could this be? Because this particular chemical was taken off the market 12 years ago. And it was a chemical that was used in retardants, but it bioaccumulates in humans as well, and it disrupts the immune system and a lot of other good things. But here's our poor little baby seal here, just with the super high levels of this chemical. That's just one chemical, just one. And if one kid gets injured from living out there, or coming into contact with that stuff, that's too many. Or one whole person, one pregnant woman, it's not right, it's not moral, it's not ethical, we shouldn't allow it. It'll forever be toxic. Dr. Lee says so. Forever be toxic. That means it'll forever be dangerous. It'll never be safe, and we don't have to engage in this craziness. We can just say no. And that's what I'm sure people in Brisbane with good sense will do just that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I have here 3 more speaker cards, Todd, Tom, and Prem. I'm not sure. No? And you are? Okay. Representing UPC engineers?
Okay, my name is Prem Lal, and good evening, Commissioners. I would like to follow up on a comment I heard earlier this evening about how we should move as quickly as possible to move forward with the EIR and perhaps certify it, because we don't have time to wait, perhaps. I personally want to disagree with that, mainly because there was a bill that was signed into law yesterday, and it is known as the Clean Energy and Pollution Reduction Act of 2015. And that was signed into law by our governor yesterday, I believe, and it makes some references to promoting the proliferation, I'll get it right eventually, proliferation of renewable energy generation in California. Not only that, but on the potential cleanup of toxic areas, whether they be air or possibly land. And I think that if we wait a little bit and evaluate this new law, which originally was Senate Bill number 350, we could potentially find ways to decrease both the financial burden, potential financial burden, and the potential liability on both the City of Brisbane and Universal Paragon Corporation. So I would see this as a win-win for both parties, instead of just jumping to move and, approve this thing as soon as possible, to wait and see whether there are funds that can be applied from outside of both the City of Brisbane and outside of Universal Paragon Corporation, which we could use, considering that we no longer have some of the funds that we thought we would have earlier on. So I just want to read to you a few lines from this bill, which is now law. So first of all, we'll begin with Section 1, and I'll try to keep this brief. So Section 1 says, this act shall be known and may be cited as the Clean Energy and Pollution Reduction Act of 2015. Section 2, the legislature finds and declares that the governor has called for a new set of objectives in clean energy, clean air, and pollution reduction for 2030 and beyond. Those objectives include increasing from 33% to 50% the procurement of our electricity from renewable sources. So that's very important, from 33% to 50%. And this is now law, remember that. Secondly, I would like to read to you a paragraph from Section 30 of this law. And Section 30 says, Section 701(1) of the Public Utilities Code is amended to read, the legislature finds and declares that in addition to other ratepayer protection objectives, a principal goal of electric and natural gas utilities resource planning and investment shall be to minimize the cost to society of the reliable energy services that are provided by natural gas and electricity, and to improve the environment and to encourage the diversity of energy sources through improvements in energy efficiency, development of renewable energy resources such as wind, solar, biomass, and geothermal energy, and widespread transportation electrification. And when they say transportation electrification, you know that one of the major components of that will be high-speed rail. And then thirdly, it goes on to say, if I can find it, in Section 19, that in soliciting and procuring eligible renewable energy resources for California-based projects, each electrical corporation, and that's one of the main players in this, so PG&E, for instance, would be something to be considered in that area. I don't think PG&E is a corporation, but it is of the kind of the same type of character as what they're talking about here, shall give preference to renewable energy projects that provide environmental and economic benefits to communities affected with poverty or high unemployment, or that suffer from high emission levels of toxic air contaminants, criteria air pollutants, and greenhouse gases. Now, it's my understanding that the Bayland soil is still leaching gases into the environment from beneath the soil that are kind of trickling up and becoming part of, I mean, if you drive, for instance, on Tunnel Road in the middle of the night, you can smell all that stuff. So I believe that this law would apply to that area because of that air contamination. So I wanted to let you know that, and so that both you and Universal Paragon Corporation can look into that further and see whether that's an option. And then finally, now that I'm done with this issue, I wanted to talk briefly about what it's like to experience an earthquake, a large earthquake, when you live in a building that is built on landfill, because I can give you some firsthand experience. I was in San Francisco during the 1989 Loma Prieta earthquake. And at the time, I lived at the top floor of an apartment tower that was made of reinforced concrete, and it was built on landfill. Now, it was over by San Francisco State University in that vicinity, and there were several towers in that vicinity, but mine was built on landfill, unlike the others. And so I was there when the earthquake started rocking and rolling. All the dishes came flying out of the cabinet. All of the windows shattered. I had an upright piano against the wall. That was tossed about 3 feet away from the wall. That is the type, and also the reinforced concrete of the building was latticed with cracks like spider webs all over the place. I'm surprised it wasn't condemned. And this was a 13-story building. So I just want to let you know what it could be like to build buildings like this on landfill, particularly here in the Baylands, and then to come back and just say, okay, well, we're done and we're going to leave now, and we'll leave that to Brisbane to deal with later on. Because when that earthquake hits, those buildings will be disasters. So just wanted to let you know.
Okay, thank you. We have Tom Graff, one more? No? Okay. John? Can you please come to the mic? We want to make sure the audience at home can hear.
Right after the Loma, I'm John Christopher Burp, still proud to be a lifelong resident of Brisbane. Right after the Loma Prieta earthquake, the USGS issued a report titled Lessons Learned from Loma Prieta. And in that report, it shows the toxic waste dump here as being subject to violent shaking and not a good place to build, basically, or to put anything like that. Also, there was some earlier an attempt to minimize global climate crisis and sea level rise. I personally talked to Dr. James Jansen, who's one of the world's foremost authorities on that, and he's looking for basically an 80-foot level increase, and not 100 years from now either. And he told me it could go as high as 250 feet if everything melts. And it's happened before. So, you know, we've been wasting time on this, and it looks like maybe our window is going to be, closed. But, that's going to be in the water down there. And that's another question. Who's going to pay for the dikes? I don't want to pay for it. I don't think the taxpayers of Brisbane ought to pay for those dikes. And the guy from BCDC, a guy named Will Travers, was going around to all the city councils and planning commissions before he retired, saying, maybe we ought not to build on this land that's right here next to the bay because of sea level rise, and it's going to be in the water, and it's going to be just a humongous problem. And he said, the state doesn't have the money, the feds don't have the money, the county doesn't have the money. Who's going to pay for it? So, maybe a little better planning instead of row, no matter what the risks. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Anja Miller, I have some other comments here. First, I'd like to address somebody making a comparison between the landfill area of the Baylands and Sierra Point. And they really are not at all comparable. And I can say that because I was personally involved in the decision-making to develop Sierra Point. And it is an engineered landfill, and that's what it was designed to be built to begin with when the 25 last years of dumping was allowed at Sierra Point. It was mandated to be engineered where there's fill and then soil, and it was known what went in there. So even then, there's problems, but the place was buildable, has been built on, and it's totally different from the unregulated landfill dump. And don't let people lead you to believe that they're somehow similar. They're not at all. As to the Melrose I've heard about, I thought it was the name of the law, the Melrose Act in Sacramento, that allowed this funding mechanism for remediation of toxics. I don't know what the district, if it has to be a separate district, or couldn't the city use the Melrose mechanism? I don't know. But that's what it originally is, a law, name of the law. Mellow was and Ruse were the people who authored that law. There are some other really mysterious things still that I read. The Master Response 2.4 on page 41 says something that is in conflict with what we heard here. It says, and I quote, following certification of the final EIR, the city would determine land uses. Well, and at the land uses at the Baylands at the general plan level. And only then would the water board come in and determine what should be done? Do you have to have a specific plan? You have to certify, make a land use, have a specific plan, and then the Regional Water Quality Board will tell you what to do or what they will do. And then there's some other quotations that I found. Master Response 10, it happens to be about archaeology, but it says generally, quote, activities that occurred prior to the 2010 baseline are not the subject of this evaluation. Another quote, it is not the role of the EIR to determine the role or consequences of prior conduct of activities. Prior conduct of activities. To me, it is all a fill and a dumping. So that statement doesn't make sense. Back to the Champion Speedway, which John Burr here described all the stuff that went in there. It's called in BCC, Response BCC 24, it's called a temporary use. Well, it operated for 16 years. There were cars racing around, and there was a maintenance pit, and that's where, of course, the batteries and hydrocarbons, oils, and everything obviously went into the land or in the fill. But the response quote says, after closure of the speedway, it was demolished and covered by fill. No traces of this former racetrack currently exist within the Baylands project site. Okay, no visible, that should be added there, because obviously there's, and the problem is with this kind of description in the EIR, that might very well lead the Regional Water Quality Board to say that to dismiss any claims, because, oh, well, they can't see, the EIR says there's no trace. And Geosyntax, I believe, may disagree, but I read that they said most of the landfill contents are wood and paper. So, if it's most, then maybe that's not all. You do have to look at the worst of all. BCC 137 talks about increased use of Caltrans and high-speed rail, and including fencing. But they are not relevant to, because they're a different plan, that they're not part of this Baylands plan. But they will be there, and there will be some fencing because of the Baylands needs. So I think the Caltrans fencing, HSR fencing should be included in the whole picture. Yeah, then there's one more thing I noticed on mitigations, 4.D2, that any attention to archaeology should only happen during construction, and if they run into something and they don't need to do it any other time, just during construction, if they run into something, then that has to be studied and determine what needs to be done. That's about it for this time, and I thank you.
Thank you. I think.
Just ask, are we still on
I think it's been a mix. I think it's really difficult to try to reconcile the two systems, the timing and then the actual subject.
I'd like to continue on. Look,
Is how much longer? There's someone else.
You know, we're at page 4.5-52, and that section goes to 4.63. I just have on here 2.5 pages. Pardon me? I beg your pardon. 2.5 pages is what I have.
Claire, can I ask you to help us out? There's one speaker who is...
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you. I won't take more time. It's just one simple question. Is there a way to find what are the chemicals listed or what are the chemicals and gases found in the Baylands? The topic is hazardous materials, but I fail to understand what is the finding? What's the percentage of a particular chemical in those gases? Because any permutations of any periodic element can be disastrous. So it would be good to know. I was hoping at the end of the presentation there will be an appendix to the findings, but I didn't find that. Or maybe it's already presented and I'm late to the party. So
could you state your name for the record so that we can...
Oh, sorry about that. My name is Meena Motwani. Thank you.
Could you spell your last name?
Motwani.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Claire.
You're welcome. The two regulatory agencies have websites, GeoTracker, and which is for Regional Water Quality Control Board, and EnviroStor, ENVIROSTOR. And the listing of what's out there is on their websites. It's not the easiest thing to use, but it does have directions. I'm just going to mention the mitigation measure to go faster. A mitigation measure 4G2D deals with NPDES. Dr. Lee, who we've heard referred to, stated that he believed that we didn't have the proper NPDES permitting for the Baylands. So I would ask that that be reviewed, that are permitting for stormwater, and it be determined whether those should be industrial permits or should they be part of the city's permit, that we should in fact follow the EPA guidelines for industrial uses. Mitigation measure 4G2E, having to deal with recology. There's one in the middle that's about emergency response under certain kinds for hazardous materials, and there needs to be a lot of attention paid to adequate response capability. It's expensive to be able to have the capability to respond safely for the firefighters or the team to a facility that handles a lot of hazardous materials. It looks to me like they're going to move the household hazardous waste facility for San Francisco into Brisbane territory. Now, if anyone knows that's absolutely not true, then I won't say anything. But and some of these mitigation measures appear to address that. I have a lot of questions about that. I wonder, about all the laws concerning the waste, taking the waste out of San Francisco County, putting it into San Mateo County. And I guess I would sure appreciate a little more clarification on that, because I think it's an issue people should know about if they're going to put it here. It has a potential it's been there for quite a while, but it has a potential for trouble because they take all the household hazardous waste for the city, and it would be moved just a little way. I think that it has dangers, and one has to be very careful about it. If you're going to move it and make it a new one, I'm familiar with the facility, and it should be larger. It should have more spill capacity. I think it should be equal to 100% of the waste there. and it should be bigger. It definitely should be bigger than it is in order to be safe. Mitigation measure 4.G2F. It's about workers and soil vapor, and I do think that there should be signage to warn workers. A lot of these things can get lost, and for their safety, I think that we should require permanent signage where there is a problem with soil vapor so people will be safe. Mitigation measure 4G2H. There should be a 50-year limit instead of 30-year limit for following whether or not there are vapors being released. We have been told at the BBCAG that it will be forever, but I think, if forever seems kind of a difficult thing to enforce, so 50 years instead of 30 years, that's in, and then mitigation measure. It's actually not in a new mitigation measure, but it's on page 456. This is about school siting, and I find it difficult that people have had a hard time understanding why a school is a problem out there. And this kind of puts it rather well. There are 3 different conditions that the state of California does not allow schools to be placed in unless there's an exception granted. And they have to do with 0.25 from a facility with hazard emissions or that handles hazardous or acutely hazardous materials. That's one. Being within 1,500 feet of a railroad track easement, or being near a fuel storage tank or within 1,500 feet of an easement above an underground pipeline. We have the pipeline, we have the fuel storage tank, we have the railroad track, and we have, really, even though it's in San Francisco, the hazardous household waste facility. So there is no way that you should put a school there. High school, elementary school, preschool, it is not a good idea. They're sensitive receptors. I think you'd want to give them a break. There's also perhaps going to be an anaerobic digester, and that's a possible air pollution source. The landfill's methane. Okay. Surface water hydrology and the NPDES permitting 4H1A is the mitigation measure. I think the permitting issue should begin at the top, not at the bottom. The way the wording and all of this and the way it's handled and the way I've heard the city engineer talk about it, it just seems like the permitting is put down to the lowest level where there are the fewest resources in order to have a robust response. And that, to me, does not make sense. So it really should be considered, rather than pushed down to us, it should be reconsidered, and that kind of goes back to a previous comment. There is something that I was recently made aware of, is that the excavation releases the mercury in bay mud with excavation and development, which then makes a further risk to groundwater and surface water. I think any reference to a 100-year flood should become a 500-year flood. Any reference to a 25-year flood should become a 100-year flood, because we should be conservative. When it comes to risking people's lives and property, we should not make it the lowest standard. I think 25 years is the lowest possible standard. I think it should be higher. I think climate change is a reason to do that. I think sea level rise is another reason to do it. 4H1C. Let's see, I'm sorry to be slow. Relating to NPDES, there's a statement here that says that the performance standard will be the best available technology economically achievable and the best conventional pollutant control technology. I think there's a need to understand what economically achievable means, what they're, how are they talking about, what kind of a percentage or something, what does it really mean, and why should you only use conventional? Why not something that is at least proven, but not necessarily conventional? I think also that environmental water quality must be tested by qualified water quality technicians and reviewed by an environmental scientist, also relating to this 4.H-1C. Sedimentation is the next 4H-4A. We need to use wetlands and swales and anything we can in order to slow down and filter the water that's coming off of our land. And when they talk about all the piping, I realize some things require piping, but it would be better for the environment, and in some ways might be cheaper if we were to do it in a more environmentally responsible way. Filtering is the key to what's needed. For H4C, Visitation Creek. Visitation Creek, I think it's extremely important that we develop that so that in the most environmentally sensitive way possible, and also to allow for the slowing of water that is coming off of some sites that are, we don't ever talk about PG&E and Levinson Marsh, but that was quite a site, if you recall, in the papers where there's lamp black there, and the residents felt that they might be affected by it. It's a proven source of pollution. In the use of pesticides, pest control in 4H5, no neonicotinoids, which are the killers of bees. You should consider when you're using pesticides whether or not they're going to kill important parts of the environment. In this pest control segment, it will be there needs to be enforcement. It's going to require oversight and monitoring. Again, you can use the Melrose district. We're getting close to the end here. The I think final one is on is 4H-8. There should be a risk assessment for the area north of Geneva. It's called for Geneva South here, but it also should be done to include the entire area all the way to the, the border with San Francisco. And it should be updated in the future to understand what the risk is, as people understand whether or not it's actually going to be higher than 1.5 meters. Thank you for your patience and your attention.
Again, Clara, please submit that to the staff so that we can have it for our records.
Yes, I definitely will. Be a few days, but I'll get it to you.
Yeah, thank you.
So much.
Thank you.
I think we had one last comment.
Okay, here we go. So one of my points is that from the previous thing about Geologic, Barbara Ebel, I think the lighter the project we put out there, the more advantageous it's going to be for us in the long run. And then I had a couple of hydrology things. Page 5, paragraph 2 states that only 4 water quality indicators are monitored. And then I don't know if that's true or not, but that seems like an incredibly low number. And I'm wondering if maybe that isn't even correct, because that seems ridiculous to even me. And then one of the measures states that a plan will be submitted in accordance with all of the rules. Okay, we get that. There's a regulatory environment they have to comply with. But at no point, and maybe this comes up later, but at no point in the, at least as far as we've gotten in the FEIR, does it say what happens if the corrective actions are inadequate. So at some point we have to deal with that. I don't know if that's dealt with in the development agreement or what, but at some point we have to, because at some point something's going to fall short. That's just a given. Nobody's perfect. No project is perfect. And then one of my big concerns is that it requires the floor elevation provide a minimum of 1 foot freeboard above the 100-year storm event. I agree with Clara that 100 years is not adequate. And 100 years in the life of a community is really pretty short. I mean, San Francisco's been around for almost 200 years now. And something like elevation, you can't go back and lift up all the buildings and raise it. Well, I guess they sort of did in Seattle, but it's not easy. And then also, this 1 foot freeboard clearance really bothers me because the sea level rise predicted is 11.8 inches, and that's a really conservative estimate. So we've got 0.2 inches of freeboard. And then if there's any kind of subsidence, we're looking at negative numbers right out the gate. And that just doesn't make any sense to me. And one other thing I noticed, and I'm sorry I didn't get the page down, is that it says there are no, it says it cites the FEIR response, like cites 5 studies that were done, field studies that were done on the land, and at no point did they notice a frog habitat in the hole for the round, for the turntable, and it's like, I've been out there with the frogs croaking. So it just, that kind of like huge disconnect of like, of not knowing that there are frogs there, it just kind of points out the inadequacy of the studies we have. Thank you very much.
Joel?
Thank you, Joel Diaz. Yeah, so I just wanted to clarify some of what I was saying earlier. So I think that the remediation for this project was originally premised on the idea that the Brisbane Redevelopment Agency was going to pay for that, the lion's share of that. And I have here a public facilities financing report, and that is the recommended project financing strategy, was to have the city pay for that. And as you know, the Redevelopment Agency has since been closed, and so that's no longer a funding source. And even in this strategy where the Redevelopment Agency was going to pay for it, work wasn't going to start or be profitable or affordable to do until 2035, which is 20 years from now, which is what I said earlier. And now that the Redevelopment Agency is not going to pay for these things, how much longer is it going to take? How much longer than 20 years will it be before it's now economically feasible for the developer to build? And I think this is really important for the public to understand and to know, because for some of them, it's like they're dangling a carrot in front of them, and they think there's going to be this really nice shopping mall and all these amenities and retail facilities out there. Yet, in reality, they're probably not going to come for 20 years, 50 years, who knows? We don't fully understand. And it doesn't make a lot of sense. Why are we rushing to approve this EIR if this thing isn't going to happen for 20 plus years, 50 years, whatever it is? Doesn't make a whole lot of sense why we're rushing to do this now. And, you know, I listened to John Burr, the attorney, speak about all these different things, and he has a really, different perspective on a lot of things. But it makes sense. It makes a lot more sense in writing when I read the minutes sometimes. But, I don't think we do know what we're doing as a society. And just because we're doing things legally doesn't mean it's necessarily safe. I think 100 years from now, we'll look back and it'll be crystal clear to us the mistakes that were made here, tonight, and the mistakes that are in the EIR. And so it seems a little out of whack that we're going to, approve this now, but wait decades before it actually happens. You know, in terms of subsidence, I don't know if people really understand at home what subsidence is. And it means that, you know, the buildings, if on piers in bedrock, will remain stationary and they won't settle. But all of the land around the buildings will sink. The land will sink, the buildings will stay, and there'll be an elevation change. And so in order to fix that, you have to bring in fill. You have to raise the elevation of the finished grade up. And it's very expensive, right? And you'll have to raise the roads, all of these things. And it doesn't happen all uniformly at the same time. It's kind of haphazardly from site to site. And so it's really hard to quantify what it's going to take to pay for that maintenance. And Clara Johnson, I want to thank her for all of her comments and all the time she spent on this. I think she's absolutely right with the Melrose concept, passing some sort of special facility district to pay for all this stuff. It's going to be very expensive. I heard the number initially to do the remediation and infrastructure was $1 billion. I wouldn't be surprised if that doubled. You know, I know the Bay Bridge was supposed to be $1 billion. It ended up being $6 billion. So, you know, it doubles, triples, 6 times whatever it is. And we don't want to have similar liability at the end of this thing, even if it is 30 or 50 years from now. So there needs to be some mechanism to finance that. And that's, you know, the facility district, a special assessment district, is much like passing a parcel tax. There's a written, you know, agreement tied to it. And it's all about the property owner agreeing to do it, to be bound by that. And then the successors, the people that own that property afterwards. So I think those are really good points and that Clara and John made. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else?
Danny Ames, and I'd like to mention, after living here for 3 decades and driving down Tunnel Road, you can see in the tank farm the building that has basically sort of raised out of the ground almost 5-6 feet. Correct me if I'm wrong, have you all seen that? Have you noticed how that the ground has sort of settled around the building and the foundation's busted and you see the rebar and the road's gotten really wavy? So that's pretty clear that that area up there is pretty active as far as subsidence goes. That's the only comment I wanted to make. Thanks.
Thanks. Okay. Would we like to hear from our expert? So can we move on?
Do we need to extend the meeting, or we don't need to?
Oh, I think everybody had a chance to make their comments, yes?
No, I think we were supposed to end at 10:30. Isn't it 10:30?
It's 10:27.
Oh, okay.
We that was our goal, but we went a little over. That's okay.
Okay.
We want to make sure we hear everyone. So
We'll wrap up quickly. I'll make a couple comments, and then Susan will finish up. A number of comments were talking about CEQA in relation to sites that are either not in the Baylands or Recology site, and then the lagoon. Just as the Commission looks at the EIR, and the whole notion of CEQA is the EIR is intended to address the impacts, the physical changes that would occur to the environment as a result of what is being proposed. So that if you have recommendations, for example, regarding what should be getting addressed in relation to the tank farm, that is not a CEQA issue for the Baylands project, but certainly could be made part of your recommendations at the end related to your planning decisions. But CEQA is going to address the Baylands and the development as is being proposed. The reason that the lagoon was not monitored and there's not an analysis of water quality on the lagoon is that the mitigation measures set forth in the EIR prevent physical modifications within the lagoon. So the area defined by the road along the north, the railroad, basically the whole triangle. Any exceptions, for example, building the road if necessary that would encroach into the lagoon, would require an entire study of the water quality impacts of doing that. But right now the mitigation measures and the EIR says no one is going to physically touch or modify that lagoon. And in relation to Recology and what uses they may want to shift around within Recology, it's important that you understand as the Commission your recommendation to the Council Nothing in this EIR authorizes Recology to expand or move any use on that site at all. They will be required, as the City Council has said, to pursue their own site-specific analysis so that if Recology would propose moving their household hazardous waste into Brisbane, that will require a separate review, separate analysis, separate EIR that Recology would be responsible for. In relation to building code, we'll make sure the revisions are made, but the most recent building code will be applied throughout the life of development of the project, so that we purposefully don't want to say 2013 building code because there may be a 2000 whatever and updates. So most recent building code would be applied in all cases, and that would also mean when the EIR refers to a 20-year build-out, when UPC starts development as a UPC issue, the EIR is working on the assumption that 20 to 25 years is the end of development, so that the EIR is working on the assumption 25 years from now, 20 years from now, all the development of the Baylands is done. Not that it first starts in 20 years. So
Okay, go ahead.
The last thing I want to say in relation to assessment districts, we'll talk about assessment districts and financing mechanisms when we get to infrastructure and utility issues in a later hearing. There's a slew of different kinds of assessment districts for different purposes, and we'll talk about that kind of public finance. And it's really a public financing program, but we'll talk about that when we get to utilities, where there's some broader application to that analysis. And then Susan will talk about some of the hazardous materials issues that were raised.
Just
Go ahead.
Just one question. When you're talking about the lagoon not being monitored, were you discussing Tunnel Road?
I'm sorry, Tunnel Road on the north, yes.
Oh.
And Lagoon Road on the north. I'm going to get all my roads mixed up.
Okay.
Lagoon Road, I'm picturing it upside down.
Right.
Lagoon Road on the north. You've got Tunnel Road on the west, Sierra Point Parkway. Basically, a triangular area that development would be prohibited in.
But the question was the impact of what you're doing at the site, what kind of impact that will have on the lagoon. That has to be studied, right?
That has to be studied.
Because that's what I want to clarify.
Right.
Because
Yes,
it wasn't
that
clear.
needs to be studied, the impacts of what is being proposed to be developed on the lagoon, not the dynamics or what is in the lagoon. And I think monitoring of the lagoon, if you think that is, that could be a recommendation. The EIR addresses impacts of development, proposed development on the lagoon.
So you will do the baseline analysis first and then figure out what will be the impact as a result of the construction.
That's already addressed.
Okay.
Thank you. If I may provide some clarification relative to the regulatory agencies and their mandate. So you have on the site itself, you have two different state regulatory agencies that have been the primary regulatory agencies. You have the Department of Toxic Substances Control, and you have the San Francisco Regional Water Quality Control Board. Both agencies have as their mandate to protect human health and the environment. And they do so using the most stringent goals that are developed and redeveloped. Right now it's at a quarterly basis where toxicologists that sit within the state of California and that are also sitting nationwide from a federal perspective develop cleanup goals for surface water, groundwater, soil that are based on toxicity studies of particular constituents or chemicals that are found in soil, groundwater, surface water, and soil vapor, which would be emissions into the atmosphere. So these stringent threshold values, cleanup values, are applied during remediation. I'd also like to clarify that for the three different areas on this site, you have operable Unit 1, which based on all of the information that I've reviewed, has been under regulatory agency oversight for 30 years. It's been investigated and assessed. It's been undergoing remediation. So OU1, part of the constituents of concern are volatiles. Bunker C fuel oil in groundwater used to be a constituent of concern, and then metals. So for the remediation that would be occurring during development of this, there are alternatives that could consist of actually excavating soil, treating the soil either off-site or potentially treating it on-site. But those potential remedial activities for OU1 would be dependent on what type of chemical it is that is being remediated, and what would be the best way to remediate that so that it would be protective of human health and the environment. Okay? The same is true for OU2, based again on all the documentation that I've reviewed. It's been investigated, assessed since the 1990s. It's been undergoing remediation for the same length of time. The constituents of concern, again, are well understood at OU2. Remedial strategies are quite similar to OU1, where there might be the potential for large volumes of soil to be excavated, removed from the property, or potentially treated on site and reused on the property. One of the things about anything labeled petroleum or total petroleum hydrocarbons or hydrocarbons is their carbon chains, and they are very easily remediated on site. I don't know if you recall when gasoline service stations seemed to be going out of business with a fair degree of regularity, and you would see a big pile of soil covered with black plastic sheeting, and that was bioremediation. Microbes that live in the soil currently consume carbon chains. So with a petroleum hydrocarbon, with anything that has a hydrocarbon in it, there are bacteria that currently reside in that soil that can bioremediate that, as long as you have conditions that facilitate that, like oxygen, for example. So those types of remediation don't contribute to additional risks of carting things through neighborhoods or emissions, and you get to reuse the material on the project site. With regard to the landfill and the Title 27 closure, the landfill itself has also been studied. There is a leachate collection system that is in place, has been in place, will have to be in place in order for that property to obtain closure under Title 27. There is also a gas collection system or a gas control system that has been in place and will need to be in place that allows the venting of methane and any other volatiles from the landfill. So it's a controlled system. So measurements from this system have indicated that the concentrations of methane have decreased over years while the system has been operating, and that's to be expected. The same type of bacteria that consume petroleum hydrocarbons will be consuming different waste products inside of the landfill. Okay? So these regulatory agencies are using stringent mechanisms to make sure that when the remediation is deemed complete, that human health and the environment is protected to the extent practicable. There was some question with regard to who's responsible for remediation. The responsibility is the landowners. There were questions relative to what studies are needed. The regulatory agencies dictate what studies are needed. More than likely, before any redevelopment or development, a human health risk assessment will be necessary. And that will really guide the process of the development. One of your last speakers was asking about the list of chemicals and constituents, and some of the other concerns that the audience was talking about was, could you see the list of chemicals and the concentrations decrease over time? And the data is there. As Claire Johnson pointed out, there are websites. There's GeoTracker and EnviroStore, and all consultants have to upload the documents to those websites. So any groundwater monitoring report will list the constituents that were detected during that groundwater sampling event, plus the sampling events that occurred. They used to be mandated to occur 4 times a year. Now they've gone to 2 times a year. Depending upon whether or not you've hit an asymptote, it could even be once a year or maybe once every 2 years. Even the list of chemicals could shrink if you started out with detecting 50 chemicals, but then slowly the list of chemicals that were being detected were 20 or 30, which is not uncommon because things will naturally attenuate. They are being remediated. So you will see fewer chemicals listed and lower concentrations over the time period that these areas have been investigated, assessed, and remediated. So it's they're database websites within the state of California EPA general website. But once you get in there and you start looking at the volume of documentation on these properties, you can understand the volume of work that has gone on to understand what the constituents are that we're dealing with and what remedial efforts have already taken place. With regard to liability to the city, at this point in time, there isn't any. The remedial responsibility is the landowners. The landowners are being regulated. They must comply with both GTSC and the Water Board. They must achieve cleanup. Both of those regulatory agencies are enforcement agencies, and they can fine the landowner. Does anybody have any questions? Yes.
Tony Varios. So that sounds like you're suggesting that the leachate system that's in place, as well as the off-gassing system that's in place, have been studied to a point where you know that they were installed correctly and they haven't, and they're adequate and they meet current standards. Is that correct?
They do meet current standards and they are adequate. You know, there were some problems. The problems were fixed. And I would assume that as the project gets developed and new technologies available, it will be implemented.
Okay, thank you. I was curious about that because when I heard you talking about it, I'm thinking that it seems I haven't got the ability to measure accurately, and I don't know whether any of the representatives here tonight could give us accurate measurements, but it seems like 30 to 60 feet worth of dirt and concrete have been added out there on top of the dump as part of the contractor who does dirt and concrete recycling. I don't know exactly what the numbers may really be, but whatever they are, then it seems that those pipes that allow the gas to escape, the methane to come out, have to be adjusted every time those levels increase. But most of us haven't been out there for a tour, so we wouldn't know about that. But I guess that's probably correct. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And the other thing you mentioned was the liability issue. It seemed to me that the only way the city is going to incur liability is if the developer goes bankrupt and the city winds up inheriting this property somehow. Then it becomes the city's responsibility. But unless the city becomes the owner of the property, it's not. That's a question for the city attorney, I guess.
Hypothetically speaking, I suppose if whatever owner owned the property would be liable for what occurred on the property, but since that's not the fact that we have at hand, I just don't really have more to say about that.
Okay.
Anja Miller, I have a question for the good doctor. Did you, in your peer review of the landfill contents, did you pay any attention to the tire dump and those battery dumps and anything that has been brought up here that we do not read in the EIR?
Absolutely. And I think it's a very valid point that the material that was deposited in the landfill was deposited based on the standards at the time, and it's much different standards than are currently enacted. So things were just dumped. They were just disposed of. So we might not know with certainty. You have different anecdotal evidence and different recollections of what was disposed, but we don't have the certainty that one would have with regulated waste or with documentation. But we do know, because of the extensive sampling, what chemicals would be coming out of the landfill. So in this instance, it's not necessary to know what went in, because we know what is potentially coming out, but it's being captured. So it's being captured in the leachate collection system, and it's being captured in the landfill gas control system.
So you did the number of boreholes to find out how deep you went into the soil to get those samples to figure out what is there.
I have not taken soil samples on the property. So other consultants have taken soil samples, but irrespective of whether soil samples or the number of soil samples or the depth of borings on the landfill itself, what is of importance is what is potentially coming out of the landfill that would have a deleterious impact on human health and the environment. And that is being captured.
But you are talking about only the off gases that are coming out, right? But
no,
there
I'm
might
talking
be some,
about the leachate.
Some solid stuff still may be there that's not leached, and that can have the environmental impact also. Oh. Because that you will tell, you see that
under Title 27, not only do you have to have an engineered cap and these impermeable layers, you have to be able to continue to monitor, and you will have to abide by land use controls. So the regulatory agencies do not take their mandate lightly. Most environmental consultants work under the premise that a regulatory agency is not their best friend forever. Regulatory agencies really impose stringent cleanup goals and have the ability to fine your client. So as an environmental consultant, you want to toe the line, to do the best work possible so that the regulatory agency agrees with the science behind the findings. So these regulatory agencies that are supervising the closure of the landfill will impose land use covenants, deed restriction, what it is that you can do on that property, what type of development would be best suited for that property. And one of the things that will be required is monitoring of landfill gas control system, monitoring of methane, and also the leachate collection. There's the potential for different drainage. All of that will be determined by the Title 27 closure process.
Regarding the regulatory agencies that you mentioned, they have the stringent requirements and all that. I worked in a regulatory environment for 40 years, and I know what type of stringent requirements they have. The case in point is California PUC, what happened in San Bruno, right? They were advocating that they have the stringent requirements, but the reality is, working in the government environment, I know that's not always the case. And I don't know your experience. From my experience, I can say that many times I always used to advocate these cities that they should have the more stringent requirements than the state or federal, because as long as their standards are higher than the federal or state, they can do that. And that's the purpose of the citizens over here. They want the more stringent than what the state and federal does. And knowing the background of all the regulatory agencies, SNAPOs in the late years, I'm just familiar with California PUC, but they were like Love Canal and all the other issues that were in the past. What the citizens want here, and it's very important to see that fact that they want more stringent than just the state regulation that we can rely on. And I think you heard over and over and over again that that's the goal of this city, citizens of this city.
Well, then I would strongly suggest that you attend the DTSC and the Water Board meetings, which are open public meetings, to make the concerns of the Planning Commission known. You could ask to be an interested party and attend the meetings and make the concerns of your constituency known to the regulatory agencies.
I don't know how that will be within the purview of the Planning Commission here. But as a private citizen, I probably will do that if I had to. And I'm very familiar with the state and federal agencies, how they operate, and that's why I raised that question. And I think that's probably the reason a lot of citizens are kind of concerned that what happens with the state agencies. I'm not saying that every state agency is like that, but there are a number of cases where we have seen that has happened. So in the EIR, there should be some kind of a recommendation regarding what the citizens desire, how stringent they want to be. And I will say there will be answers saying that all we can do is live with what the state and federal requirements are. That's okay. That's EIR's job, what the consultant is going to say. But from my own perspective, I will say that we need to have more stringent than what the current standards are. And there is nothing wrong with that. I don't think anybody will disagree with me if I ask for more stringent than the less. So.
Then as you get to the end of the process and you're making your recommendations to the city council as part of this, if that is where you want to go, make that recommendation that the city should push for standards A, B, C, and D.
Mm-hmm.
And that's appropriate at the end of your process as you're making your recommendations.
Yes.
As to the anecdotal testimony, isn't eyewitness testimony a little bit more weighty than anecdotes? And if you want another anecdote, I do remember several years back hearing an official from the Regional Water Quality Control Board as definitely saying that the landfill was nothing but household waste, not to worry about it, and they were too busy elsewhere to worry about Brisbane. That was a statement.
I certainly meant no disrespect relative to anecdotal information. I'm talking strictly from a scientific perspective where there's documentation that's written down in a manifest form versus what would be known from the long-term residents here. And I'm sure everybody has had negative experiences with individuals representing public agencies.
Okay. The 2 points are that the only chemical coming out of the leachate is unionized ammonia. That's all they're finding. Whatever the potentials are, that's it. And Vic Powell, P-A-L, is the man who represents the Regional Water Quality Control Board with relation to the landfill. And he told the BBCAG that he had hundreds, perhaps 200 different cases. And as with many other state agencies, they're underfunded and they're overworking those representatives to the point where they can't do the kind of job that they'd like to do. I think they are well-intentioned and I think they're skilled people, but I don't think that they have time to do their job because they're given too many cases. Thank you.
Danny Ames, since we have your expertise in the room, what would the factors be whether on-site remediation would take place? Is there pros and cons? Is there expense? Is it based on how much hazardous materials there? In your assessment, could you reply to that?
If it was strictly petroleum hydrocarbons, on-site would be the most appropriate way to do remediation. You have some metals, and metals actually are a naturally occurring element. Soil has metals. If you went to a undeveloped piece of property in your backyard, even a softball field, and took samples, you would find metals in there. The same metals that you're finding at this property, hopefully in different concentrations, but they're an element. So metals are the ones that are tricky, because there are different alternatives for remediating soil. You can do thermal remediation where you're literally taking soil away and you're taking it someplace where they burn the soil. You can fix metals in soil. Again, that tends to be off-site. Something that's petroleum hydrocarbon certainly lends itself to on-site remediation.
If there was a battery dump, would it be more problematic?
Well, batteries, you would expect to find metals, some acids in the soil. So, yeah, that would probably not lend itself to on-site remediation.
And what about this possibility of a tire dump? Does rubber break down? And
well, that's really the landfill.
Okay.
So that's not OU1 and OU2, where the possibility of actually excavating soil or treating the soil in place was discussed.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I have one question.
Sure.
It's my understanding that the rules and regulations have changed, and now most of the toxins have to remain on site in the soil and not be moved. Is that a misunderstanding, or is that an understanding?
Well, I don't know where you heard the information from.
Probably at a city council meeting.
Okay. Well, and I don't know, what the context of that would be, but I have worked on numerous projects that have gone through remediation recently, and one of the things as a consultant that you typically don't want to do is the dig and haul, because there are so many different alternatives, and dig and haul has its own risks associated with it. So, but I have worked on projects recently where we have had to remove soil from the site and haul it off-site for actually fixing of lead in they add Quikrete lime to fix the lead in the soil, and then you can actually treat that soil through thermal desorption.
And then was the soil brought back, or it was or new soil was put in?
Well, in this particular project, they didn't need the soil to be brought back. It was a roadway project, so they were actually trying to get down to different elevations so they could do the subgrade differently than when the road had been originally placed. But a lot of the facilities that do the thermal desorption actually then that's considered recycled soil, and so it can be sold to other projects that need fill.
Okay, that answered my question. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Anyone else?
Hi, Joel Diaz again. I'd just like to say thank you to the expert for her comments, and just want to clarify that stringent regulations doesn't guarantee safety. They're more like guidelines to safety. People can still get hurt. People can still die, just like Jamil brought up about San Bruno when the gas lines blew up. So, in terms of guaranteeing safety, I think that's really something that you guys possess, is the ability to guarantee safety. I think these stringent regulations are more like guidelines to safety. And about the time frame, I just wanted to clarify that here in the Public Facilities Financing document 9.3.2, the Baylands is expected to occur, the development in the Baylands is expected to occur by 2035. And that's with the redevelopment money, which we don't have. So logically, we can infer that it would be after that time, after 2035. Thanks.
I want to thank Jamil for making his comment about how we will hopefully impose stricter guidelines than what the state or federal government do, because I'm a firm believer that that's not a bad idea. It's a good idea, and it can be done. It's just a matter of will of the leadership, whether it's your commission's recommendation and then later the city council to follow up on, or if they punt to the voters, then it was up to us. But as long as it's put forward properly and legally, it's a good idea. Regarding the time of development and how much it costs, I think there's, if anybody in the room knows the answer to that, it would be Mr. Scharfman. And I'm not going to speculate on how much UPC's owner has in the bank, whether he's got $1 billion or $10 billion, and how soon he wants to disgorge himself of it. But my impression is, from what Mr. Scharfman said, is the sooner they can start building, the better for them, and they'd be happy to do it. So, I'm not as concerned about how many years it takes to have anything built. I'm more concerned about the direction that the commission and the city has a vision, promotes a vision for in terms of the land use. What's the preferred land use in order to achieve the best results for the city, and whoever is out there working or using the property for recreation or any other purpose in the future. That's our responsibility, I think. And also I want to make note that while I'm not a geologist or an earthquake specialist, I am an insurance broker, and I have studied earthquakes extensively because it's part of my business. I also grew up in San Francisco, so I can proudly say, as one gentleman here who said he was a proud be born and raised and always living in Brisbane. Well, I was born in San Francisco, so I've lived through quite a lot of earthquakes in a number of different structures when they happened. And I'm not going to go into that now because I don't want to waste our time. But if anybody wants to talk about earthquakes on their own time, I'd be happy to give you all you want to know about them. It's all about what's going to happen there is not going to be a 13-story building or the Bank of America swaying back and forth on the Baylands, because you're not going to allow that to be built out there. My impression is, from what I see in the Schlegelach portion north of 01 or whatever, OU, whatever it was called, the northern sector of the train yard, is something like 5 or 6 stories. So that's a mitigation factor all by itself. Anyone who's an engineer knows, as was Mr. Zola said earlier, if you're building a smaller building, it's going to be engineered one way quite differently from if you're building a Costco. Thank you for your patience.
I don't want to comment on that geology part because this is not my time yet. I'm a geologist and geotechnical engineer. So when my time comes, I will make remarks on that. Thank you.
Okay. Anyone else?
Okay.
So thank you very much. This is an ongoing process, so we don't need to close the public hearing. Thank you for your attendance. We'll see you next week. On to the consent calendar. Before we make a motion to accept the consent calendar as presented, is there any need for or any suggestions for modifications?
Excuse me, Madam Chairman, there's a point of order. When you don't have any items on the consent calendar, there are no items, you don't formally have to choose to act on it.
Okay, easily done. In terms of oral communications, does anyone want to address the commission on any issue that is not on the agenda? Okay, seeing one. Would you come?
Yeah,
I think
we have to make a motion to continue the public hearing. So I make a motion to continue the public hearing.
And I second that.
Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
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 Okay. I think it was understood, but it's okay. We can do it formally. So oral communications, anyone? No. Okay. Written communications. I just want to acknowledge two written communications. One is from Clara Johnson in regards to her comments for last week's biological and cultural resources public hearing, and also to Tony Verios also for the issues presented at that hearing on biological and cultural resources. Thank you very much. Does anybody else have any other written communications?
No, we don't have anything else.
Okay. Any items initiated by the staff? That's different from what's listed here, which is none.
No, I don't have anything.
Okay.
First time you put none here.
Any items initiated by commission?
I have one suggestion, a question which was brought up last week, which was to change and this is the transportation to a further meeting. It didn't seem a place to bring it up, so I wanted to ask about that.
Well, you may have seen the agenda, again, because it's an early meeting in the week. The agenda's already been published and the staff report's been published. If at the end of the meeting or that date you choose to, and we'll have a consultant here, our traffic consultant will be here that day.
So
you certainly can continue the public testimony if you're so inclined, but we will have a staff report prepared and the agenda's ready.
So what you're saying is that we should keep it at the same date?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and if you want to continue it, that would be your discretion.
I see what you're saying. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. You mean more than one night? If we cannot finish it in the same session,
right.
Then we can continue that.
Right. Just like tonight, we anticipated probably longer, but we're here at 11:07, and it seems adequate.
Okay.
So we'll work with whatever comes up.
All right, that was my only question.
Okay. Make a motion to adjourn to the meeting of October 13, 2015 at 7:30 p.m.
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you.
Thank you and good night.